Welcome back to Mr. Darkveil, where the darkest roads tell the darkest stories. Canada stretches over 10 million square kilometers, and its highways swallow people whole. Truckers spend hundreds of hours alone on roads where the nearest town is 3 hours back, and your CB radio is your only lifeline. So what happens when something out there finds you first? These are 11 real Canadian trucker horror stories that will make you think twice about the open road. Stay until the end. Story 11 will haunt you. Let's get into it. It was the third week of November, the kind of cold that does not ask permission before it kills you. A trucker had been running freight out of Dawson Creek, British Columbia for going on 11 years. He knew the Alaska Highway the way most people know their own kitchen. Every bend, every frost heave, every section where the asphalt gives way to packed gravel, and your steering wheel starts to vibrate like something underneath the truck is trying to shake loose. He was not the kind of man who got spooked easily. 11 years on northern roads teaches you that the highway has no interest in your feelings. You drive, you stay awake, you get home. That was the job. He had left Dawson Creek around 9 in the evening, which in November means he left in complete darkness. The temperature outside was sitting at -28 and dropping. His load was construction materials heading up toward Watson Lake, a run he had done maybe 40, 50 times over the years. He had his thermos of coffee, his CB crackling with the occasional transmission from another driver somewhere behind him, and 6 hours of highway ahead of him. Nothing unusual. Nothing that should have made that night any different from 100 other nights exactly like it. He was about an hour and 40 minutes outside of Dawson Creek, somewhere in that long, black stretch between the Toad River turnoff and the next fuel stop, when his headlights caught something on the shoulder of the road. At first he thought it was a deer. Out there on the Alaska Highway, wildlife on the road is not a surprise. Moose, caribou, foxes cutting across the gravel. But as he got closer, his brain registered the shape differently. 2 legs, an arm raised, a person, standing on the side of the highway in -28-degree darkness, flagging him down. Now here is something non-truckers do not always understand. Stopping for a hitchhiker on a remote northern highway in the dead of winter is not just a casual decision, it is a calculation. If that person is genuinely stranded, leaving them there could mean leaving them to die. Hypothermia at those temperatures does not take long. But picking up a stranger on an empty highway at night carries its own risks. Dale pulled the truck to a stop. He told himself later that he did not really have a choice. You do not drive past a human being in that cold and just keep going. The man who climbed up into the passenger seat looked to be somewhere in his 60s. Heavy canvas jacket, work boots, a wool cap pulled down low. No bag, no backpack, no gear of any kind beyond what he was wearing, which for a night like that was nowhere near enough. His face was calm, not panicked, not shaking, not the way a person looks when they have been standing in -28 for any length of time. Dale noticed that immediately but pushed the thought aside. He asked the man where he was headed. The man said he needed to get back home. Said it quietly, almost like he was talking to himself more than to Dale. Dale asked where home was. The man gave a name, a property, a homestead, described by a landmark Dale half recognized, maybe 15 kilometers further up the road on the left side, back in off the highway through a stand of spruce trees. Dale nodded. He had driven past that area hundreds of times, thought there might be an old access road back in there somewhere. He pulled the truck back onto the highway. And here is where you need to ask yourself something. If a stranger gets into your vehicle on a deserted road in the middle of the night, and seems completely unbothered by the cold, no shivering, no relief, no urgency. At what point does your instinct start whispering that something is wrong? Dale said the man barely spoke for the next 10 minutes. Just sat there, hands in his lap, looking straight ahead through the windshield. Dale tried a few times to make conversation, asked if he had broken down somewhere, asked if he had family expecting him. The man answered in short, flat sentences that did not quite line up with the questions. Not rude, just slightly off, like a conversation with a delay in it. Dale kept driving. He kept his eyes on the road, but his attention had split, part of it on the highway, part of it on the man sitting 3 feet to his right. Then the man said, "Turn here." Dale looked to the left. There was a gap in the tree line, barely visible, just a thinning in the spruce where an old track pushed back into the bush. No sign, no mailbox, No lights anywhere beyond the tree line. Dale slowed the truck and asked if he was sure this was the right place. The man said yes. Said his family had lived there a long time. Said there would be a light on inside. Dale did not turn in. The track was too narrow for the rig, and he said so. He told the man he could drop him at the road and the man could walk in from there. The man nodded, seemed to understand. He reached for the door handle, then paused for just a moment and looked at Dale directly. The first time during the entire ride that he had really looked at him, and said, "You are a good man for stopping. Most people do not stop anymore." He climbed down out of the cab, and Dale watched in the side mirror as the man walked toward the tree line and disappeared into the dark. Dale pulled the truck back onto the highway and kept driving. He reached the next fuel stop about 40 minutes later, a small operation with a diner attached, the kind of place where the same 3 people have been working the counter since 1987. He went in, got a coffee, and mentioned to the woman behind the counter that he had picked up an older fellow back down the road. Described roughly where, described the man. She stopped what she was doing. She asked him to describe the access road. He did. She asked him what the man looked like. He did his best. She was quiet for a moment, and then she told him that the property back in off that track had been abandoned for decades, that a family had lived there years ago, a husband, wife, 2 adult sons, and that the place had burned to the ground in the late 1980s, a fire in winter. Nobody made it out. Dale said he laughed when she told him that, the kind of laugh that is not actually a laugh. He said he went back out to his truck and sat in the cab for a while before he could make himself start the engine again. He thought about the man's hands in his lap, the complete absence of shivering, the calm, the way he had looked at Dale right at the end and said, "Most people do not stop anymore." Past tense, present tense, all of it blurring together into something Dale could not explain and has never been able to explain since. He finished the run to Watson Lake. He filed no report. He told almost no one. But here is the thing that stays with you long after everything else fades. Dale said the passenger seat of his cab was cold when he reached the fuel stop. Not the normal cold of a northern night seeping through the door seals. Cold the way a space gets cold when something has been drawing heat out of it. He runs the heat in that cab constantly now, even in summer. He says it never quite feels warm enough on that side. The Alaska Highway is just under 2,400 kilometers long. It cuts through some of the most isolated terrain on the continent. And if you have ever driven it at night, you already know that the darkness out there is not like regular darkness. It has weight to it. It presses against the windows, and sometimes, on the long, empty stretches between nowhere and nowhere else, the light from your headlights hits the shoulder of the road, and for just a second, just the briefest fraction of a second, you think you see something standing there. Most drivers keep going. Dale used to be one of them. He is not anymore. It starts with a sound, that is all, just a sound. And if you have ever been alone in a vehicle at night, miles from anything, you already know that a sound with no explanation is one of the most destabilizing things a human being can experience, because your brain does not let it go. It pulls at it, it builds around it, and by the time you have spent an hour alone with an unexplained sound and no way to verify what is causing it, the inside of your own cab starts to feel like the most dangerous place in the world. This is what happened to a driver hauling a sealed refrigerated trailer out of a meat processing facility on the outskirts of Red Deer, Alberta. He had been trucking for about 9 years at this point, long haul mostly, prairie runs, occasionally up into northern Alberta when the work called for it. He was reliable, experienced, the kind of driver dispatch trusted with sensitive loads, because he did not cut corners, and he did not ask unnecessary questions. That last part matters, because on this particular night, not asking questions was the thing that nearly broke him. The load had been arranged through a third-party broker, which was not unusual. He was given a pickup window, a seal number to verify at the gate, a destination address outside of Calgary, and instructions that the trailer was not to be opened under any circumstances until it reached the receiving dock. Temperature-controlled cargo often comes with those instructions. Pharmaceuticals, certain food products, biological samples. There are loads where the integrity of the environment inside the trailer is the entire point, and breaking the seal early can compromise the shipment and expose the carrier to serious liability. He had hauled sealed loads before. He signed the paperwork, verified the seal number matched his documentation, watched the yard crew hook the trailer, and pulled out of the facility just after 10:30 at night. The first hour was completely normal. He was on the QE2, Queen Elizabeth II Highway, heading south toward Calgary. 4 lanes, well lit in sections, light traffic for a Tuesday night. He had the radio on low, the heat set where he liked it, coffee in the cup holder. The rig was running clean, nothing to report. The sound started sometime around the 45-minute mark. He described it later as a knock. Not a mechanical knock, not the kind of irregular thudding you get from a loose mud flap or something shifting in an improperly loaded trailer. This was deliberate, spaced. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more, coming from somewhere inside the trailer behind him. He turned the radio down and listened. Silence for maybe 30 seconds. Then 3 knocks again. Same rhythm, same spacing. Now ask yourself honestly what you would do in that moment. You are on a highway at night. You have a sealed trailer you have been explicitly told not to open. You are hearing what sounds like a pattern. Not random movement, not settling cargo, but a pattern. What is the first place your mind goes? His first instinct was mechanical. He ran through the possibilities. Refrigeration units on trailers make noise, compressors cycling, fans, coolant lines. But he knew those sounds, and this was not one of them. He thought about cargo movement, but the manifest listed the trailer as empty, which is why the broker rate had been lower than usual. A return trip haul, trailer repositioning, happens all the time. Empty trailers do make noise. Road vibration, air pressure differences, the trailer body flexing on uneven pavement. He told himself that is what it was. The knocking stopped for a while, long enough that he almost convinced himself he had imagined it, or misidentified it. He turned the radio back up, drank some coffee, watched the highway. Somewhere south of Innisfail, the traffic thinned out almost completely, and it was just him and the dark and the white lines coming at him out of the headlights. Then it came back, and this time it was different. 3 knocks, the same as before, but after the pause, instead of repeating the same pattern, there were 2 knocks, then 1, then silence, then 3 again, then 2, then 1, descending, like a sequence, like something counting down, or like something that had heard him turn the radio up and adjusted, trying a different pattern to get his attention. That is the moment he said his hands went cold on the steering wheel, not from the temperature, from something older than temperature, from the part of the human nervous system that has been detecting wrongness since before we had words for it. He got on his phone, hands-free, mounted on the dash, and called the broker number on his paperwork. No answer. It was close to midnight by this point. He tried the processing facility, got a nightline recording. He called his dispatcher, got through, explained what he was hearing. His dispatcher told him it was almost certainly trailer noise, told him to complete the delivery, told him if he was genuinely concerned, he could pull over and do a walk-around of the exterior. Exterior only. Do not break the seal. He pulled off at the next rest area, climbed out of the cab into the cold Alberta night, and walked the full length of the trailer. He knocked on the exterior walls with his fist in 3 places. He stood and listened. Nothing. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily at the front of the trailer. The seal on the rear doors was intact, the number matching his paperwork exactly. No signs of tampering. No signs of forced entry or exit. He crouched and looked under the trailer. Nothing. He stood there for a moment in the parking lot, a single light buzzing overhead, the highway 100 meters away, and told himself he was done letting a noise get inside his head. He got back in the cab, pulled back onto the highway, and within 10 minutes the knocking started again. But here's what changed this time. This time, when he went silent and turned everything off and just listened, he realized something he had not registered before. The sound was not coming from the rear of the trailer. It was coming from the front, from the section of the trailer closest to the cab, from right behind the wall he was sitting against. Whatever was making that sound was as close to him as it could possibly get while still being on the other side of a wall. He did not stop again. He made a decision in that moment that he has described differently at different times. Sometimes he calls it the professional decision, sometimes he calls it the coward's decision, and sometimes, on the nights when he thinks about it most, he calls it the only decision he could live with, which was to drive. Just drive. Get to Calgary. Get to the receiving dock. Let someone else deal with whatever was or was not in that trailer. It was not his load to open. It was not his problem to solve. He was a driver. He drove. The last 40 minutes of that run were the longest 40 minutes of his career. He turned the radio up loud enough that he should not have been able to hear anything from the trailer. He could still hear it. The knocking had changed again, less rhythmic now, more irregular, and occasionally beneath the knocking, he thought he could hear something else, something that might have been a voice, or might have been the road, or might have been his own blood moving too fast through his ears in the silence between sounds. He has never been fully sure which one it was. He is not sure he wants to know. He reached the receiving dock in Calgary at 12:40 in the morning, backed the trailer into the bay, went inside and handed his paperwork to the night receiving clerk, and told the man flatly that there was something wrong with his trailer and that someone needed to check it before he signed anything. The clerk looked at him, asked what he meant. He said he had been hearing knocking from inside for the past hour and a half, and he wanted it documented before the seal was broken, because he wanted it on record that he had reported it. The clerk called a supervisor. The supervisor came out, checked the seal number, verified it against the manifest, and then cut the seal and opened the rear doors. The trailer was empty. Bare aluminum floor, bare walls, refrigeration running, not a single item inside. No cargo, no debris, no indication that anything had ever been in there. The supervisor looked at him. He looked at the supervisor. He walked the full length of the interior himself, running his hand along the walls, looking at the floor for any kind of mark or track or disturbance. Nothing. He asked the supervisor if there was any chance the manifest was wrong, any chance the trailer had been used for something before it was assigned to him. The supervisor said he would look into it. He never received a follow-up call. He invoiced through the broker, got paid, and the job closed like any other job. But there are a few things he has never been able to make fit neatly into the empty trailer explanation, and they are worth sitting with. The knocking changed pattern mid-drive. Random trailer noise does not change pattern in response to a driver turning his radio up. Random trailer noise does not migrate from the rear of a trailer to the front section. And random trailer noise, in his 9 years of experience, does not produce what he heard in those last 40 minutes. That low, intermittent sound beneath the knocking that he has never fully described to anyone because he does not have the right word for it, and he is not sure the right word exists. There is one more thing. When he did his post-trip inspection back at the yard later that night, he found the interior temperature log from the trailer's onboard system, a printout that refrigerated units automatically generate, recording the internal temperature at regular intervals throughout the journey. The temperature inside that trailer had been holding steady at -4 degrees Celsius, exactly where it should be for the type of load listed on the manifest, for the entire run. -4, for a trailer that was empty, that had allegedly been empty since it left the facility. Running a refrigeration unit at -4 degrees Celsius costs money. Nobody runs refrigeration on an empty trailer repositioning run. There is no reason to. He knows that. He has thought about it more times than he can count. He has never come up with an answer that satisfies him. The Queen Elizabeth II Highway runs nearly 300 kilometers between Edmonton and Calgary. Thousands of trucks move up and down it every single week. It is about as routine a piece of Canadian highway as you can find. Wide, flat, well-maintained, used so often that most drivers stop seeing it after a while. It becomes wallpaper. Background. Just the road between point A and point B. He still drives it. He has to. It is part of the job. But he has never hauled a sealed refrigerated trailer since that night. When a sealed reefer load comes up in the dispatch system and his number is next in the rotation, he finds a reason to pass it. His dispatcher has noticed, has asked about it once or twice. He tells them it is a personal preference thing, that some loads just are not for him. What he does not tell them is that sometimes, on the quiet stretches of the QE2 late at night, with the radio low and the highway empty in both directions, he still hears it. Not from behind him, not from any trailer. Just there, at the edge of the road noise, underneath everything, barely there and then gone. 3 knocks, a pause, and then 2. There is a specific kind of fear that belongs only to whiteout conditions. It is not the fear of speed or heights or something chasing you. It is quieter than all of those. It is the fear of erasure, the fear of being in a place where the world simply stops existing beyond the glass in front of you, where forward and backward and sideways all become the same direction. where the only thing separating you from complete disorientation is a white line you can no longer see. Drivers who have never experienced a true prairie whiteout cannot fully understand what it does to a person, and drivers who have experienced one never forget it. This story comes from a trucker who had been running the Trans-Canada Highway between Winnipeg and Swift Current for the better part of a decade. Saskatchewan prairie driving is its own discipline. It looks simple from the outside, flat, straight, no mountain grades, no hairpin turns. What people who have never driven it do not understand is that the prairie offers you nothing to hold on to. No landmarks, no elevation changes, no tree line close enough to the road to give you a sense of where the shoulder ends. In clear weather, it is monotonous. In bad weather, it becomes something else entirely. Something that has swallowed trucks whole and returned nothing but an accident report and a family without a father. He had left Winnipeg on a Wednesday morning in early February with a full load of retail goods heading to a distribution center outside Swift Current. The forecast when he left was manageable. Some wind, possible flurries, the kind of winter advisory that Saskatchewan issues so routinely between November and March that most prairie drivers treat it like background noise. The sky was gray and low when he crossed into Saskatchewan, but the road was clear, the traffic was light, and he was making good time. The change came fast. That is the thing about ground blizzards on the prairie that forecasts consistently fail to communicate. It is not always about snowfall. The snow is already there, sitting on the fields on either side of the highway, and all it takes is the right wind, sustained, sharp, coming from the northwest at the right angle, and within minutes that snow is moving horizontally across the road at eye level, and visibility goes from 2 kilometers to 20 meters to nothing. Not gradually, not with warning, it just goes. By the time he was 40 kilometers east of Swift Current, he was in it. He slowed immediately, the way any experienced prairie driver does, and clicked on his four-ways. He could see maybe 1 truck length ahead of him. The wind was hitting the side of the cab hard enough that he could feel it in the steering. Not dangerous yet, but present, demanding attention. He got on the CB and called out his position and conditions. Got a response from a driver somewhere behind him, maybe 20 minutes back, who confirmed the same conditions and said he was pulling over to wait it out at a rest area he had just passed. He considered doing the same. He was close enough to Swift Current that stopping felt like giving up on time he did not have. The delivery window was tight. He decided to keep moving, slowly, using the white line on the right shoulder as his guide. This is standard practice in whiteout conditions when you cannot see the center line. You hug the right edge, keep it just visible in your peripheral, and you creep forward. It is not comfortable, but it is manageable if the road stays straight and the wind stays consistent. And then he saw the truck ahead of him, or what he thought was a truck. In whiteout conditions, your eyes grab onto anything solid, any shape that is not white, with enormous relief. The human brain in a whiteout is starving for reference points, and it will latch on to whatever it can find. What he saw was a shape. Dark, large, rectangular. The silhouette of what appeared to be a semi. Running lights visible, maybe 4 or 5 truck lengths ahead of him. He exhaled. Another truck ahead of him meant a path. It meant someone else was reading the road, and he could use them as a moving reference point, keep a safe distance, let them lead. He followed the shape for what he estimated was close to 2 hours, maybe a little more. Time does strange things in a whiteout. There is no scenery changing, no landmarks passing, nothing to mark the minutes except the white and the wind and the shape ahead of you. He kept his distance, kept his speed down, watched those running lights with the focus of a man whose life depended on not losing them. Every time the gusts intensified and the shape ahead blurred at the edges, his grip tightened on the wheel until visibility came back enough to find it again. He was so focused on following that shape that he almost did not notice when he started to gain on it. The lights ahead were getting closer. Not because he had sped up, he checked his speed and it had not changed, but because the truck ahead was slowing down, or had already stopped. He eased off further, gave more space, waited for the shape to start moving again. It did not. He got closer, and closer, and then close enough that his headlights, fighting through the blowing snow, finally illuminated it properly for the first time. It was not moving. It was in the ditch, not freshly in the ditch, not recently off the road. The snow had drifted up the sides of the trailer to a depth that takes hours to accumulate in those wind conditions. The running lights, the lights he had been following for 2 hours, were not running lights at all. They were reflective tape on the side of the trailer, catching his headlights and throwing them back at him. The truck had been there for a long time, long enough for the drifts to reach halfway up the trailer walls, long enough that whatever had put it there was not a recent event. And now you need to understand what this means, because this is the part that most people who have not driven in whiteout conditions do not immediately grasp. He had been using a stationary object as a moving reference point for 2 hours, which means for 2 hours he had not been following anything. He had been navigating on his own, in complete whiteout, without any external reference point at all, and his brain had constructed the illusion of a moving truck ahead of him because it needed something to follow and would not accept the alternative. The running lights he had watched so carefully, the shape he had trusted with his life, none of it had ever been moving. It had all been in his head, built from reflective tape and desperation, and the particular cruelty of what extreme whiteout conditions do to human perception. But here's the question that he could not shake once the visibility finally improved and he got the truck stopped safely and sat there on the shoulder with his flashers going and his hands shaking against the steering wheel. If the truck in the ditch had been his reference point for 2 hours, and it had never moved, then what had he been tracking when the shape seemed to drift slightly left and then correct, the way a moving vehicle on a windy road naturally does? What had he been watching when the lights ahead seemed to dim and then brighten as if passing through denser snow? Reflective tape does not do that. Reflective tape is passive. It returns what you give it, and nothing more. He sat on that shoulder for a long time before he trusted himself to drive again. The wind was dropping by then, and the visibility was slowly improving, the blowing snow thinning out as the gust front moved east. He could see the ditch truck more clearly now, a flatbed, older, no markings he could identify from the road. He got out and walked toward it. The cab was empty, no sign of a driver, no note on the windshield, no emergency triangle set out on the road. Just the truck, sitting in the ditch at an angle that suggested it had gone off slowly, rather than in a sudden loss of control. The kind of angle you see when a driver feels the shoulder give way and just rides it down, rather than overcorrecting. He reported it on the CB and to the RCMP when he reached Swift Current. They told him the truck had been called in already, by a westbound driver earlier that morning. It had been in that ditch since at least 6 a.m. He had passed it at roughly 3 in the afternoon. It had been sitting there for 9 hours before his headlights found it, and his brain turned it into something it was not. He made his delivery, signed the paperwork, found a truck stop and ordered food he did not eat. He sat in that booth for a long time, turning something over in his mind that he could not quite articulate to the waitress who refilled his coffee twice and left him alone because she had worked that truck stop long enough to recognize the specific kind of quiet that settles over a driver who has had a bad one out there. What he kept coming back to was not the whiteout itself, and not the ditch truck, and not even the 2 hours of following something that was not moving. What he kept coming back to was a moment, somewhere in the middle of that 2-hour stretch, when the shape ahead had done something that at the time he had explained away as wind effect or visibility fluctuation. The shape had appeared to slow down significantly, almost to a stop, and then, he had been certain of this in the moment, it had appeared to move backward, toward him, just briefly, just enough that he had tapped his own brakes instinctively before the shape seemed to resume its forward position and continue. Reflective tape on a stationary trailer does not move backward. It does not move at all. Wind does not make a fixed object appear to reverse direction in a consistent, controlled way. He knows that. He has no explanation for what he saw in that moment, and he stopped trying to find one somewhere around the 3rd cup of coffee in that booth in Swift Current. He still drives the Trans-Canada, still runs the Saskatchewan stretch through winter, because the work is there, and he is good at his job, and he has a family that depends on that. But he has a rule now that he did not have before that February run. If he is ever in whiteout conditions again, he pulls over. Full stop. No delivery window is worth it. No tight schedule. No dispatcher pressure. You pull over, you set your flashers, and you wait. Because the prairie in a whiteout does not care about your schedule. It does not care about your experience, or your instincts, or your 11 years on Saskatchewan roads. It will take everything you think you know about driving, and quietly, without any drama, without any warning, replace it with something that looks exactly like knowledge, but is not. And by the time you realize what has happened, You have been following a ghost for 2 hours, through the worst visibility conditions on the continent, completely alone, with no idea where the road ends and the ditch begins. The Trans-Canada Highway through Saskatchewan runs for just under 650 kilometers. In clear summer weather, it is one of the most straightforward drives in the country. Flat, direct, well-marked. Drivers who do it for the first time often remark on how easy it seems, how open, how you can see forever in every direction. That is exactly the problem. When the weather takes that visibility away, it does not just take the view, it takes everything. And what it leaves behind in the white and the wind and the silence is something that prairie truckers have understood for generations and cannot quite explain to anyone who has not been in it. The highway gives, and sometimes in February, when the northwest wind decides it has somewhere to be, the highway takes. And the only question that matters, the only one, is which side of that equation you end up on when the snow finally stops. There is a version of fear that does not announce itself. It does not spike your adrenaline or make you want to run. It settles. It sits down next to you, and it waits. And the longer it waits, the worse it gets, because your brain keeps searching for the specific thing that is wrong and keeps coming back empty. Something is off. You know it. You cannot name it, and the not naming is the thing that undoes you. Most people have experienced a version of this in ordinary life. A conversation that ends slightly wrong, a smile that does not reach the eyes, a room that feels different from how it should feel without anything in it having visibly changed. These moments are unsettling in everyday life. In a deserted way station on a northern Ontario highway at 3 in the morning, with nobody else around for 40 kilometers in either direction, that feeling does not stay unsettling. It becomes something much harder to sit with. This driver had been doing long-haul runs between Winnipeg and Thunder Bay for about 6 years when it happened. The Yellowhead Highway through northern Ontario is not a road that gets a lot of attention in trucker conversations compared to something like the Coquihalla or the Alaska Highway. It does not have the dramatic mountain grades or the famous weather events. What it has is length and darkness and the particular grinding isolation of northern Ontario bush, spruce and rock, and frozen lake on both sides of the road for hundreds of kilometers. The kind of landscape that makes you feel like civilization is not just far away, but might not actually exist at all, in any direction except the thin black ribbon of asphalt you are sitting on. He had left Winnipeg in the early evening and was making reasonable time. The load was dry goods, nothing complicated, delivery at a warehouse outside Thunder Bay the following morning. He had done this run more times than he could count. He knew every fuel stop, every decent diner, every stretch where the road surface went bad and you had to ease off. He was comfortable, settled in for the night the way experienced long-haul drivers get settled, not relaxed exactly, but calibrated. Everything in its place, everything normal. He came up on the way station at roughly 3:15 in the morning. Now here's what you need to understand about way stations in northern Ontario in the middle of winter. They do not run 24 hours. Many of them post seasonal closure notices and go dark for months at a time. A driver who runs the same route regularly gets to know which stations are open and when, because pulling into a closed way station is a waste of time, and pulling past an open one carries serious consequences. This particular station was one he knew well, and he was almost certain, not completely certain, but almost, that it should have been closed for the season. The lights were on. Not just the exterior lights, the interior was lit. And the signal board at the entrance was displaying the red illuminated letters that mean all commercial vehicles must pull in. He checked his mirrors out of habit, looked ahead, and pulled the truck into the station the way you do when the board tells you to. You do not argue with the board. You pull in, you get weighed, you get inspected if they want to inspect you, you get back on the road. He brought the truck to a stop on the scale platform and waited. Through the window of the station building, he could see a figure at the desk. Uniformed. The light inside was that particular institutional fluorescent that way stations and government offices share. Flat, slightly greenish. The kind of light that makes everyone inside look slightly unwell. The figure at the desk appeared to be writing something. Head down, pen moving. Normal. Completely normal so far. The officer came out after maybe 2 minutes. Walked to the driver's side. Gestured for him to roll the window down. He did. The officer was the right age for the job, the right build, wearing the right uniform, Ministry of Transportation of Ontario. The insignia correct, the jacket correct, the clipboard in hand with what appeared to be the standard inspection forms attached. He asked for the logbook and the bill of lading. The driver handed them over. And that is when it started. Not with anything dramatic. Not with anything he could have pointed to in that moment and said, "That is wrong. That is the specific thing." It was more that the interaction had a texture to it that was slightly off. The officer looked at the logbook the way you would expect an officer to look at a logbook, flipping pages, checking entries. But his eyes were moving at the wrong speed, not scanning the way someone reads information, moving across the page in a way that was more like performance than examination. Like someone who had watched the action of reading a logbook and was reproducing the movements without the underlying purpose. He asked the standard questions. What are you carrying? Where did you load? What is your destination? The driver answered all of them. The officer wrote things on his clipboard, or appeared to write things. The pen moved. Whether it was actually making contact with the paper was something the driver could not verify from his angle. Do you want to know what the single strangest detail was? Out of everything that happened in that station, out of all of it, the detail that the driver has come back to more than any other is this. At no point during the interaction did the officer make prolonged eye contact. He looked at the clipboard. He looked at the truck. He looked slightly past the driver when he was asking questions, at a point just over his left shoulder, the way a person looks when they are trying to remember something, rather than looking at the person in front of them. In a normal conversation, you might not notice this. In a deserted way station at 3 in the morning, with every other instinct already on quiet alert, it registered like a cold hand on the back of the neck. The inspection took longer than it should have. Not dramatically longer, maybe 10 minutes over what a standard check would normally run. The officer walked the truck twice, checked the seals, looked at the tires, came back to the window and asked 2 questions he had already asked, the destination and the load description, as if the first answers had not been recorded anywhere. The driver answered again, watching the officer's face for any sign that he recognized he was repeating himself. There was no such sign. Then the officer handed back the logbook and the bill of lading and told him everything was in order and he was free to go. Standard language, the exact phrasing that officers use. The driver took his documents back and then, because he could not stop himself, because something in him needed to try to close the gap between what he was feeling and what he could actually identify as wrong, he asked a question. He asked the officer how long the station had been open this season. A normal question. The kind of thing a driver who runs the route regularly might ask just to update his own mental notes about which stations are operating. The officer looked at him. For the first time in the entire interaction, looked directly at him, and said nothing for a moment that lasted just slightly longer than silence should last after a simple question. Then he said, "We are open when we need to be open," and walked back toward the station building without another word. The driver sat on the scale platform for a moment, put his documents in order, pulled back onto the yellowhead and drove. He told himself the officer was just odd. Government workers on overnight shifts at isolated postings can get strange. The isolation does things to people. The night hours do things to people. And maybe this particular officer had been alone in that building for too long, and it showed in the way he carried himself. That was a reasonable explanation. He worked with it for about 20 minutes. Then he called another driver he knew well, a guy who ran the same route in the opposite direction, and had been doing it for even longer. He described the station, the location, the approximate kilometer marker. Asked if his contact knew whether that station had been operating this winter. His contact was quiet for a second, then said he had driven past that station 3 times in the last 6 weeks. All 3 times it had been dark, closed, no board, no lights, no sign of operation. He had driven past it just 4 days ago, in fact, and it had been completely dark. The driver sat with that. 4 days ago, dark and closed. Tonight, lit up, staffed, operational, running inspections at 3 in the morning on a highway with almost no traffic. He filed no report that night. He was not sure what he would even say. He had been inspected at a way station. The officer had seemed unusual, but had done nothing that crossed a clear line. His documents had been returned. He had been told he was free to go. Nothing about the encounter was something he could point to in a formal complaint and have taken seriously. What was he going to say? The officer did not make enough eye contact. The pen might not have been touching the paper, but he did something the following morning that he is glad he did. He called the Ministry of Transportation Ontario District Office and asked, as a routine inquiry, about the operating status of that station. He gave the kilometer marker, he gave the date, he gave the approximate time. The person on the other end of the line checked, came back after a few minutes, told him that station had been closed since mid-November, that it was not scheduled to reopen until spring, that there were no staff assigned to it, and no inspections conducted there during the closure period. He asked the person to repeat that. They did. Closed since mid-November. No staff, no inspections. He thanked them and ended the call and sat in the parking lot of the Thunder Bay warehouse for a long time, going back over it. The lit building, the uniformed figure at the desk, the clipboard, the questions asked twice, the pen that may or may not have been writing anything, the eyes that looked just past him rather than at him, the pause before the answer that was not really an answer. We are open when we need to be open. There is a category of experience that sits in the space between what you can prove and what you know. He cannot prove anything about what happened at that way station. He has the interaction itself and the ministry's confirmation that the interaction should not have been possible. And that is all. No physical evidence. No record of an inspection on his file because, when he thought to check later, no inspection from that night appeared in the ministry's system under his plate number or carrier profile. Whatever the officer had been writing on that clipboard, it had not produced any official record. He still runs the Winnipeg to Thunder Bay route. It is his living, and he is not going to give it up because of one night that he cannot explain. But he does not drive past that way station the same way anymore. Even when it is dark and clearly closed, the way it is supposed to be, he finds his eyes going to the window of the building as he passes, checking, looking for the flat greenish light behind the glass, looking for the shape of a figure at a desk. Most nights there is nothing, just a dark building and the bush pressing in on both sides, and the yellowhead stretching out ahead of him into the northern Ontario dark. But some nights, when the road is empty and the hour is wrong and his eyes are tired from the miles, he thinks he sees something in that window, just a shape, just a suggestion of light where there should not be any light. And his foot goes a little heavier on the accelerator, and he watches the rear view until the building is gone behind the tree line, and the highway ahead is all there is again. He has never pulled in a second time. He never will. Because whatever was in that building on that particular night in the middle of a closure period, whatever stood at that window and walked his truck and asked him the same questions twice, it told him it was open when it needed to be open. And he has decided, firmly, permanently, that he will never again be something that it needs. There are two kinds of fear on a mountain road. The first kind is the fear you feel on the way up, the exposure, the drop on one side, the guardrail that looks thinner the higher you climb. Most people know that fear. It is the fear of height, of falling, and your body understands it immediately and completely. The second kind is different. It belongs only to the descent. It is the fear that arrives not with a drop, but with a realization, slow, mechanical, absolutely certain, that the thing you have been trusting to keep you alive has quietly, without drama, without warning, stopped working. And unlike the fear of height, which at least has the decency to be obvious, this fear comes with math. Your brain does the math instantly and without mercy, and the answer it produces is always the same. At this weight, on this grade, at this speed, without functional brakes, here is where this ends. No ghost, no stranger, no unexplained phenomenon. Just a 40-ton truck, a 6% grade, freezing rain on the Coquihalla, and the physics of a situation that does not negotiate. This story belongs to a driver who had been running BC mountain routes for close to 8 years when it happened. He had done the Coquihalla Highway more times than he could accurately count. The pass between Hope and Merritt that climbs to just over 1,200 meters and drops the other side on grades that demand respect from every driver who attempts them, but demand something closer to complete submission from anyone behind the wheel of a loaded commercial vehicle. The Coquihalla is not forgiving of mistakes. It is not forgiving of equipment that is not properly maintained. And it is especially not forgiving of a combination of factors that individually might be manageable, but together produce a situation that unfolds faster than a human being can fully process. He had loaded out of the lower mainland on a mid-October morning. The load was mixed freight, fully loaded, just under the maximum allowable weight. The forecast for the Coquihalla that day was listed as deteriorating, possible freezing rain above 800 meters, wind advisory in effect for the summit section, temperatures hovering right at zero, the kind of forecast that makes experienced mountain drivers pay attention, but does not, on its own, make them turn around. The Coquihalla issues weather advisories the way Saskatchewan issues wind advisories, frequently enough that responding to every one of them with a full stop would make the route commercially unviable. You read the forecast, you check your equipment, you make the call. He checked his brakes at the inspection pull-out before the climb. This is not optional on the Coquihalla. It is legally required. And beyond the legal requirement, it is the kind of thing that mountain drivers do with the same automatic thoroughness that pilots do pre-flight checks, because they understand viscerally what the alternative looks like. The brakes felt right. Air pressure holding correctly. No unusual response in the pedal. Nothing in the system behavior that flagged a problem. He pulled back onto the highway and began the climb. The climb up the Hope side of the Coquihalla is long, and it works on your equipment in ways that the flat does not. Your engine is working harder. Your transmission is working harder. The whole drivetrain is under sustained load, rather than the variable load of flat highway driving. This is normal. This is what mountain driving is. You manage it with proper gear selection. You watch your temperatures, you take it seriously, but you do not catastrophize. He had done this climb in worse weather than this. He reached the summit section and began the descent toward Merritt. The freezing rain started about 3 kilometers into the descent. Not heavy, not immediately alarming. A light glaze beginning to form on the road surface, the kind that shows up as a slight change in the sound of the tires against the pavement. A subtle smoothing of the road noise that experienced drivers register almost subconsciously. He adjusted, dropped his speed, increased his following distance from the vehicle ahead, though there was not much traffic on the road at that point. He was in a low gear, using the engine to help manage his speed, standard mountain descent technique. Everything still within the range of manageable. He applied the brakes for the first time on the descent, at a point where the grade steepened, and his speed needed to come down. The pedal went to the floor, not partially, not with reduced response. It went to the floor with almost no resistance, and the truck did not slow down. Here is the thing about brake fade on a mountain descent that the textbook explanation does not fully capture. It does not feel like a mechanical failure. It feels like the road has changed the rules. One moment you are a driver with control over a large vehicle on a difficult road, making correct decisions, managing the situation professionally. The next moment, you are a passenger. The truck is still yours in the sense that you are sitting in it and your hands are on the wheel. But the relationship between your inputs and the truck's behavior has been severed in the most critical way possible. And what you are left with is momentum and gravity, and a road that continues to descend for several more kilometers. Brake fade on a loaded commercial vehicle happens when the brakes overheat to the point where they lose the friction necessary to function. It can happen when a driver rides the brakes too hard on a long descent instead of using engine braking, but it can also happen when there is a pre-existing issue in the braking system that the pre-trip inspection did not catch. A seal, a line, a component operating right at the edge of its tolerance that holds through the flat and the climb, and then fails on the descent when the thermal load pushes it past what it can handle. He had not been riding his brakes. He had been doing everything right. The system failed anyway. His speed was building. Now ask yourself what you do in that moment. Not what the training manual says. Not what the theoretical correct answer is. What do you actually do when you are in a 40-ton truck on a 6% grade in freezing rain with no functional brakes, and your speed is climbing, and the road ahead is curving, and there is no runaway truck ramp visible yet, and your brain is simultaneously running the physics calculation and trying to find a way to make the answer come out differently than it keeps coming out? He did not panic. He has said this, and people have expressed skepticism, and he understands why. Because panic seems like the only reasonable response. But panic is a luxury that the situation did not offer him. Panic requires a moment where you are not actively doing something, and from the moment the pedal went to the floor, he was actively doing everything he could think of. He pumped the brakes, no response. He downshifted further, trying to get maximum engine braking. He felt the engine straining against the load and the grade, and it helped, slightly, not enough. He kept his hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road ahead, and he started looking for options. Options on the Coquihalla in that section are limited. The road is built into the terrain, rock face on one side in sections, significant drop on the other. The shoulder varies in width. There are runaway truck ramps on the descent, but they are positioned for the most critical sections, and he was not yet at the sections they were designed for, and he was not sure he was going to reach them at a speed that still left him with choices. He started using the shoulder, not going off the road, using the gravel edge of the shoulder as a braking surface, easing the right tires onto the loose gravel to create friction that the brake system was not providing. This is not a technique from any training manual. It is the kind of decision that gets made when the manual's options have been exhausted and the situation is still developing. The gravel helped, marginally, enough to feel like he was doing something rather than nothing, which matters psychologically when everything else has been taken from you. The freezing rain was heavier now. The road surface under his remaining tires was a glaze. His speed had climbed to a point that he has declined to specify precisely in any retelling, because the number, he says, is not the point, and stating it out loud makes it too concrete in a way he is not comfortable with. What he will say is that it was faster than he had ever moved on a descent on that road, faster than the road was designed to accommodate at that weight in those conditions. He found the ramp. A runaway truck ramp is a gravel-filled escape lane built off the side of a mountain highway at a steep upward angle. The design is simple and brutal. You leave the road, you enter the ramp. The deep gravel and the upward grade absorb your momentum and bring you to a stop. They are built to save lives, and they do save lives. And they are also, from the perspective of a driver entering one at speed with a fully loaded trailer, one of the most violent experiences a person can have in a vehicle and walk away from. The gravel catches, the truck bucks and shudders, and the forces involved are significant enough that damage to the vehicle and injury to the driver are common, even in successful escapes. He took the ramp. The truck entered the gravel at speed, and the deceleration was immediate and severe. He was thrown against the harness hard enough to leave bruising across his chest and shoulder that lasted 2 weeks. The trailer pushed against the cab as the rear of the rig caught differently than the front. The truck yawed, rotated slightly sideways, before the gravel overcame the momentum, and the whole thing came to a stop partway up the ramp, sitting at an angle, steam rising from the engine, freezing rain ticking against the windshield. He sat in the cab for a moment. Just sat. His hands were still on the wheel because he had not yet told them to let go. Then he got on the radio and reported his position and requested assistance. His voice, by his own account, was level. The dispatcher who took the call asked him to repeat himself twice, not because the transmission was unclear, but because what he was reporting did not immediately compute. A driver on a runaway ramp on the Coquihalla in October. Equipment failure, requesting recovery. The recovery took several hours. The brake inspection after the fact found a failed component in the system, a failure that the pre-trip inspection had not revealed, because it was the kind of fault that hides under normal operating conditions and reveals itself only under sustained thermal stress. The truck was recovered. The load was transferred. He was checked over by paramedics at the scene, cleared physically, and offered trauma support, which he declined at the time, and accepted several weeks later when it became clear that declining had not made things easier. He went back on the Coquihalla. It took him about 3 months before he felt ready, and he has been clear that the decision to go back was not bravery, it was practicality. It is his route. It is his living. Standing at the bottom of a mountain and deciding you will never go up again, because coming down once went wrong, is not a viable position when the mountain is your job. But he checks his brakes differently now. Not just at the mandatory inspection point before the climb. At every pullout on the descent. Every one. He stops. He checks. He satisfies himself that the system is doing what it is supposed to be doing, and then he continues. It adds time to every run. His dispatcher knows about it, and has never pushed back, because the dispatcher was on the radio the day he called from the ramp, and understands, in a way that does not require further explanation, why the extra stops happen. The Coquihalla Highway handles millions of vehicle crossings every year. It is a critical link in BC's transportation infrastructure, kept open through conditions that would close lesser roads, maintained and monitored, and taken seriously by everyone responsible for it. It is also a mountain, and mountains do not make exceptions for professional experience or correct technique or equipment that passed its last inspection. The grade does not know who you are. The ice does not care how many times you have done the descent before, and if the brakes go on the wrong section of the wrong grade on the wrong day, all of your experience and all of your training and all of your years on the road reduce to a single brutal calculation that the mountain has already completed before you even realize you are doing the math. He knows that now, in a way he did not know it before. Not intellectually. He always knew it intellectually. In his body. In his hands when they tighten on the wheel at the top of the descent, and his foot goes to the brake pedal for the first test application, and he waits, with everything he has, for the resistance that tells him it is still there. The detour sign had been hand-lettered. That was the first thing that felt wrong, not wrong enough to stop, just wrong enough to notice. Marcus had been on this stretch of Highway 2 enough times to know there was no scheduled construction between Red Deer and Innisfail. But the orange cone arrangement was convincing, and the sky ahead was burning down into that particular shade of Alberta dusk that made everything feel like a warning he hadn't learned to read yet. He turned off onto the gravel road without much argument. The tires on his Tacoma crunched and popped over the loose stones, and the radio, halfway through a country station out of Calgary, dissolved into static within 100 meters. He didn't bother trying to find another signal. He'd driven worse roads than this. The prairies were full of them, unnamed routes connecting one invisible point to another, cutting straight lines across sections like someone had simply insisted on going where they wanted to go, regardless of what was in the way. The road ran flat and unbending for about 2 kilometers. Then the canola fields on either side gave way to older growth, a line of poplars, a barbed wire fence so weathered it had gone gray, and beyond the fence, the unmistakable roofline of a farmstead, gambrel barn, 2-story house, a scattering of outbuildings between them, the kind of property that had been in someone's family since the homesteading days, probably. The kind of place that didn't appear on satellite maps because it had existed before anyone thought to photograph the Earth from space. Marcus let his foot ease off the gas. Every light was on, not just porch lights, not just the kitchen. Every window on every floor of the house blazed yellow and warm against the bruising sky. The barn had light coming from the gaps between its boards, thin, bright seams of it, which meant the work lights inside were running. 2 vehicles sat in the yard. A green John Deere tractor with the cab door hanging open, and a white half-ton parked at an angle that suggested whoever had parked it had not been thinking about parking when they did. The whole property had the look of a place in the middle of everything. Supper being made, chores being done, life underway. He pulled onto the shoulder and stopped. He'd been 40 minutes off the highway already, and the road ahead showed no signs of looping back toward the 2. He needed to know how far this detour ran, or whether he'd be better off reversing out and finding another route. A farm this active would have someone who could answer that. Marcus got out. The evening air hit him right away. That particular Alberta autumn cold that had no humidity behind it, just open sky and dryness and distance. His footsteps on the gravel were very loud. He could hear the poplars moving slightly in a wind he couldn't feel from where he stood. Somewhere in the canola behind him, something rustled and went quiet. He walked toward the house. The front path was concrete, original pour, with crabgrass growing through the expansion joints. A ceramic pot beside the front steps still had a geranium in it, a late-season thing, a little wilted but not dead. Someone had remembered to water it recently. He climbed the 2 steps to the porch and found the storm door unlatched, sitting an inch open on its pneumatic hinge, and behind it the main door closed, but with light visible in the gap at the bottom. He knocked. The sound traveled clearly through the still air. He waited, looking at the mat under his boots. It read, "Welcome home," in faded block letters, and listened for the sound of footsteps inside, for the sound of a television being muted, for the particular shift in ambient noise that meant someone had registered his presence and was coming to the door. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time, and then held his breath to listen. The house made the sounds that old houses make, a tick somewhere in the walls, the low moan of something settling. From deeper inside, or maybe from outside somewhere behind the house, a faint mechanical sound that might have been a pump, or might have been the wind doing something strange through the eaves. Still no footsteps. He waited a full minute. 2. He stepped back from the door and looked up at the windows on the second floor, all blazing. He stepped sideways off the porch into the grass and looked at the kitchen window. That was when he stopped moving. Through the window, visible clearly in the full kitchen light, a table was set. 3 plates, 3 glasses of what looked like water or juice, still full. A pot sat in the center that he could tell, even from where he stood, had been recently used, something dark on its surface that could only be steam. And a pan on the stove, burner still lit. What would make a family leave a meal on a lit stove? He stood in the grass and did not have an answer to this. And the not having an answer was physical, a sensation he felt in the back of his throat and along the outer edges of his hands. He had the sudden, completely irrational urge to go around to every door on this property and lock it from the outside. He did not move toward the house. He moved toward the barn instead. He wasn't sure why. The barn was lit from within, he'd established that, and people were more likely to be in a working barn at this hour than in a house with the stove on and the food untouched. That was the logic. The logic was thin, but it was something to carry. The barn doors were the old sliding kind, mounted on an overhead rail, and one of them stood open about 2 feet. He put his hand on the edge of the door and paused. The work lights inside were running, mounted on stands, the white LED kind that lit everything without shadow. 6 stalls on each side, all empty. The concrete floor between them had been swept recently. A manure bucket sat near the center drain, fresh. Baling twine cut into lengths and stacked neatly on a bench. A chain hoist in the ceiling above the center aisle, swaying very slightly. He could smell hay and diesel and the faint ammonia of livestock, but the livestock themselves were absent. No sound of animals anywhere in the building. He walked to the far end and opened the back door and looked out at the rear paddock. The gate was closed and latched. The paddock was empty. Where do 30 head of cattle go on their own? He turned and walked back through the barn and out into the yard. The tractor. He hadn't looked at the tractor closely. The cab door was open, the engine off. But when he climbed the step and leaned in, he saw the key was still in the ignition, turned to the first position, accessories live. The dash indicator lights were on. A Tim Hortons cup sat in the cup holder. He touched the outside of it through the door without picking it up, not sure why, and found it still warm. He got down from the step and stood in the yard and looked at the house. The kitchen light. He could still see the faint curl of what he now had no doubt was steam rising off whatever was in that pot, visible even through the window glass from this distance, because the air outside had gone cold enough that the condensation on the window itself was just beginning, and the moisture from the cooking was doing something to the glass from inside. Someone had been standing at that stove 15 minutes ago, maybe 10. He pulled out his phone. 1 bar, fluctuating. He tried calling the non-emergency RCMP line and got a recording and a hold time estimate of 12 minutes. He hung up. He thought about calling 911 and then tried to imagine how that conversation would go. He had found a house with its lights on. The food was hot. No one was answering the door. He looked at the vehicles again. The half-ton had a magnetic business sign on the driver's door, an agricultural supplies company out of Lacombe. Whoever drove it had stopped here for business or had been stopped mid-delivery. The canola field behind the barn to the east had a path through it. Not a track, just a disruption, a line of disturbed stalks that led from the edge of the yard in a direction that had no destination he could see from here. Just the darkening field, and beyond it the flat horizon going purple. The path was fresh. The stalks along the edge of it were still moving, slowly, returning to their positions. He had stopped looking for an explanation by this point. He understood, in a way that bypassed whatever part of his brain usually required evidence, that an explanation would not be helpful here. An explanation would require him to follow that path into the canola, and he was not going to do that. He understood this about himself with sudden and complete clarity. He was going to get in his truck, and he was going to reverse down the gravel road to the highway, and he was going to drive north until he found a turnoff that was on his Maps app, and he was not going to think about the steam, or the key in the ignition, or the way the path through the canola looked like it had been made by multiple people moving together in a direction that had nothing on the other side of it. He walked back to the Tacoma. He opened the door. He sat down and closed it. He sat for a moment and looked at the farmhouse, every window still blazing, the kitchen light, the shape of the table through the glass, and the 3 plates, and the two chairs he could see pulled back at angles suggesting they had been pushed back quickly. And the third chair, the one at the head of the table, the one facing the window, facing him, still tucked in, neat, as if whoever sat there had not left in a hurry, had not left suddenly, had simply stood up and gone somewhere and intended to come back. He started the truck. He did not put it in reverse immediately. He sat and watched the house for another moment and tried to name what he was feeling, because it seemed important to name it, because unnamed things had a way of expanding. It was not fear exactly. It was proximity to something that had no place in the grammar of ordinary evenings. He had knocked on a door, and no one had answered. That was it. That was the sum of observable events. People didn't answer doors all the time. They were in the shower. They were in the basement. They had their earbuds in or the television too loud. Farmers especially. Farmers had 1,000 places to be that weren't the front door. But the food was hot, and the car was warm, and the cattle were gone, and the canola was still moving. He put the truck in reverse. The gravel under his tires sounded different going backward, or maybe he was listening differently. And when he reached the point where the poplars lined the road on either side, he found that he was holding his breath and did not remember when he had started. He let it out. He checked his mirrors obsessively. Nothing behind him, just the road and the fence and the failing light. And after another 300 meters, he was back at the highway, and the detour sign was still there, and the orange cones were still arranged exactly as they had been, and he turned north onto the 2 without signaling because there was no one to signal for. The radio came back immediately, the same country station, mid-song. He drove for 20 minutes before he found a place to stop, a gas station, lit and inhabited, a teenager behind the counter selling him bad coffee and asking how his night was going. He said fine. He paid. He stood at the counter for longer than was necessary and let the ordinary sounds of the place, the refrigerator hum, the digital lottery display cycling through jackpots, the bell above the door when another customer came in, settle over him. He did not mention the farm road. He did not describe what he had seen. He thought about it for a long time on the drive home, and later lying in his own bed in his own house, with the ordinary darkness of an ordinary room around him. He thought about what was worth calling in, and what the right thing to do was, and whether it was possible, at some level, that there was a simple explanation, a medical emergency, a fire call somewhere on the property, a thing he couldn't see that made it all make sense. He called the RCMP detachment in Red Deer the next morning. He gave them the road description, his best approximation of the location, the business name on the magnetic sign. The officer took the information efficiently and asked if he'd seen anyone in distress, and he said no. And she said they'd send someone out to check on it, and she thanked him. He never followed up. He's told himself several times that no news is good news. The steam off that pot, the chair tucked in, the path through the canola that was still moving when he looked at it. Some things don't have explanations that fit inside the size of the thing they're explaining. He stopped driving that stretch of Highway 2. Danny Kowalchuk had been running the Hearst corridor for 11 years, and he knew the sound of his own truck the way other men knew the sound of their own breathing, without thinking about it, below the level of thought, in some part of the body that doesn't use words. The Kenworth T680 was his, and his alone. Company owned it technically, but Danny had put 60,000 kilometers on it in the last 14 months, and the seat had conformed to the specific architecture of his lower back, and the CB was set to his preferred squelch, and the pine tree air freshener on the rear view had long since stopped smelling like anything, but had stayed because he'd stopped noticing it was there. It was his. The way a man's coat is his, or his kitchen table. He pulled off at the lay-by just east of Hearst, at 2:17 in the morning. He knew the exact time because he'd looked at the dash clock before cutting the engine, the way he always did, a habit from years of logging time-sensitive loads. The lay-by was unmarked, a widening of the shoulder worn into the gravel by decades of trucks like his stopping for decades of reasons like this one. He'd been on the road for 4 hours since Kapuskasing, and his bladder was making a reasonable argument, and the load wasn't due in Cochrane until 7 a.m., and there was no reason to be heroic about it. He climbed down from the cab. The night outside was the particular darkness of northern Ontario in October. Not the romantic darkness people who live in cities imagine when they think about wilderness, but a functional darkness. A darkness that simply meant the absence of anything built by human beings for a significant distance in every direction. The tree line was close on both sides of the highway, and the sky above the road was a narrow channel of stars doing nothing for visibility. He did what he'd stopped to do, watching the dark tree line on the south shoulder without seeing it, thinking about nothing specific the way tired men think on night runs. Just a low hum of images and fragmentary thoughts that didn't connect into anything coherent. He zipped up and walked back around to the driver's side. Here is the thing about Danny Kowalchuk. He was not a careless man. He was not the kind of driver who left his cab unlocked at rest stops, or who picked up hitchhikers, or who was cavalier about the 100 small safety habits that 11 years of night hauling had built into him. He checked his mirrors before every lane change. He kept his logbook current. He did not drive impaired, not even at the edge of tired the way some guys considered acceptable. He climbed back in. He closed the door. He ran through the mechanical check, mirrors, gauges, the feel of the wheel, and pulled back onto the highway. He drove. The road north of Hearst is straight in a way that most roads are not. It runs without significant curve or elevation change for long enough that your eyes begin to play games with the distance, the headlights illuminating the same picture of asphalt and tree line and center line over and over, until it acquires a repetitive quality, almost hypnotic, the kind of driving that requires attention precisely because it demands so little. Danny had the CB on low, a murmur of other truckers on distant channels, and the heater running at 18 degrees, because that was the temperature at which he stayed awake best. Not comfortable, just slightly cool enough to keep the body honest. 40 minutes. He drove for 40 minutes. He would go back over this later, in the days after, when sleep had become complicated, and try to identify the exact quality of those 40 minutes, what he'd been thinking about, whether there'd been any sensation, any physical awareness, any animal instinct that had tried to reach him and failed. He couldn't find it. His mind had been on the road and the load, and the particular quality of the frost on the yellow center line in his headlights, and in the back of some other room in his brain, the ordinary low-level calculations of a man doing familiar work in a familiar place. ETA, fuel level, whether the diner in Cochrane would be open when he arrived. Nothing. 40 minutes of nothing wrong at all. The truck he passed was a flatbed running the other direction, southbound, loaded with what looked like prefab wall panels. It was the kind of passing that happened hundreds of times a night on the corridor, two sets of headlights coming together and separating in under a second. The brief pressure wave that you felt before you heard it. Danny barely registered it consciously. But the chrome on the flatbed's passenger side step caught his headlights at the exact angle. The reflection lasted less than half a second. In it, he saw the interior of his own cab, the back of his seat, the sleeper partition, and below the partition's edge, partially visible, a pair of boots. He drove for another 3 seconds. The distance those 3 seconds covered at highway speed was approximately 240 meters. He knew this later. At the time, the 3 seconds had a different quality. They were the seconds between the lightning and the thunder, the seconds of understanding arriving after the fact, the brain insisting on completing its sentence before accepting what the eyes had just handed it. Then his hands went tight on the wheel, and his foot came off the gas. He did not brake hard. He would think about this later too, why he didn't brake hard. He thought the answer was that some part of him understood, in those first 3 seconds of understanding, that sudden movement was not what the situation called for. He eased the truck to the shoulder with a slowness that was almost ceremonial, the hazard lights on, the engine still running, the whole 62 feet of truck and log load settling onto the gravel with a long sigh of air brakes. He sat. His hands were still on the wheel. The sleeper was behind him, and to his right. A curtain separated it from the cab, a gray thermal curtain on a bead rail, the kind of thing that truckers used when they needed to sleep during the day and wanted to block the light. The curtain was closed. He had not closed it when he'd started driving tonight. He was certain of this with the kind of certainty that you can only feel about something after it's become important. He had not closed the curtain. He had been in the cab alone since 10 p.m., and the curtain had been open because he occasionally used the convex mirror mounted at the sleeper entrance to check his load settings, and he preferred it open on night runs, a personal habit, Something about not wanting the closed space at his back. The curtain was closed. He could hear nothing from behind it. What does a man in a 60-ton loaded logging truck on a highway in northern Ontario at 3 a.m. actually do? Danny didn't move for a long time. He was trying to locate in himself the physical ability to take action, and it kept not being there, kept resolving instead into this very specific alertness. Every sense turned outward and backward simultaneously, listening for breath behind him, for movement, for any indication that whatever was in his sleeper was also aware that the truck had stopped. The boots he'd seen in the reflection. Work boots, he thought. Dark, lace-up, the kind any man in northern Ontario might be wearing in October. He had not seen them long enough to confirm anything beyond that they were there, and they were pointing upward, which meant the person wearing them was lying on their back. Lying flat and still for 40 minutes while he drove. He reached for his phone without taking his eyes off the curtain. He had it in his hand. He unlocked it. The call connected after 4 rings, and the OPP dispatch officer had the particular calm of someone trained to receive information from people who were not calm. He spoke quietly. He gave his location from memory, kilometer marker, highway number, the lay-by west of where he'd originally stopped. He described what he'd seen in the reflection. He described the closed curtain. He did not raise his voice. The officer told him to stay in the cab, keep the doors locked, and stay on the line. He stayed on the line. He stared at the curtain. It occurred to him that the person behind it was either asleep, genuinely, deeply asleep, in a way that meant they'd been there since before Hearst, possibly since Kapuskasing, or they were awake and choosing not to move. He ran both of these possibilities through his mind and found that they were equally wrong, equally incompatible with any framework in which this was something that could be explained away. The first option meant someone had climbed into his locked truck at a fueling stop and gone to sleep in his sleeper, which meant intent, getting somewhere, hiding somewhere, using his truck for some purpose he'd never agreed to. The second option was worse, because it meant they were listening to him, right now, 3 feet away behind a curtain, hearing him describe them to a dispatcher in a quiet voice. His hazard lights clicked, clicked, clicked. He watched the curtain, and the curtain did not move. 15 minutes later, he saw the blue and red in his mirror, an OPP cruiser coming up from the south, then another, pulling in behind him with their light bars washing the cab in color. He heard the crunch of boots on gravel, then a knock on the driver's door, and he lowered the window and saw a constable he didn't recognize with a flashlight and a hand on his radio. "You the one who called in?" Danny said yes. "Stay in the vehicle. We're going to approach from the passenger side." He watched in the mirror as 2 officers moved along the passenger side of the truck. He heard the passenger door open. He heard the sound of the curtain rings on the bead rail, the sound of it being pulled back, and he turned then. He couldn't help it. He turned in his seat and looked. The sleeper was empty. The mattress was there, the sleeping bag rolled at the foot of it, his duffel in the corner, everything exactly as he'd left it in Kapuskasing when he'd pulled his route bag out at the start of the run. No one. Nothing disturbed. The constable stood with his flashlight moving across every corner of the small space, and then he looked at Danny without expression. "Nothing here." Danny said he understood. They checked under the truck, around the load, the external compartments on both sides. They walked a distance back down the shoulder in both directions with their flashlights. They came back and spoke to him through the window with the careful neutrality of officers who had seen tired men imagine things on night highways before. "You sure about what you saw?" "I saw boots," Danny said, "in a chrome reflection. Chrome can distort. Angle of incidence, what you were expecting to see. I saw boots." The constable wrote something in a notebook. He gave Danny a card and told him to take a break before continuing, and if he saw anything else to call again. The cruisers left. The highway went dark and quiet. Danny sat. The sleeper was empty. He had watched 2 officers confirm this. He understood this information and held it alongside the other information, the information of what he had seen in the chrome, and he found that the 2 things did not cancel each other out the way they were supposed to. They simply sat beside each other. A reflection, and then nothing to explain the reflection. He climbed into the sleeper himself. He needed to do this. He sat on the edge of the mattress and put his hands on the surface and looked at the space and looked at the curtain from the other side, and looked at the narrow panel along the bottom of the mattress frame where a person, a thin person, might conceivably. He stopped this thought. He felt the sleeping bag. He didn't know what he was looking for. He moved his hand along the bottom edge of the mattress. The sleeping bag at the foot. He'd left it rolled tight, the compression straps buckled, the way he always stored it. The straps were unbuckled now. The roll was looser. He told himself this meant nothing. He told himself this with force and intention. He climbed back into the driver's seat. He sat for 10 minutes. He started the truck and pulled back onto the highway and drove to Cochrane without stopping, arrived at 5:40 a.m., 20 minutes before the scale house opened, and parked in the lot and did not sleep in the sleeper. He slept in the seat, slightly upright, until the lot filled with other trucks and other drivers, and the ordinary sounds of a working morning made the previous night feel like something that had happened to someone he used to know. He filed an incident report with the company. He described the reflection and the closed curtain and the loosened sleeping bag. The safety manager listened and noted it down and said these things happened on long night runs, and asked if he wanted to be moved to a day route temporarily. He said no. He kept the night route. But he drives the Hearst corridor differently now. He checks the sleeper before every run, physically enters it, opens the storage panels, looks at every space large enough to hold anything. He does this in the Kappa's casing depot lot, under the fluorescents, before he even starts the engine. He does it again at fuel stops. He does it in the way that men acquire rituals that other people might call paranoid, if they didn't understand what had made them necessary. He also changed something he's never explained to anyone, not to the company, not to his wife, not to the other drivers who share the corridor and swap stories at the Hearst Tim Hortons on slow mornings. He drives with the curtain open now, always open. He needs to be able to see the whole interior in his peripheral vision. He needs to know, without turning his head, that the space behind him is empty. Most nights it is. Most nights he makes the run clean, Kappa's casing to Cochrane and back, and the CB murmurs and the frost is on the center line, and the tree line holds steady on both sides, and there is nothing in the sleeper but his gear. Most nights. But there was a Tuesday in November, a clear night, no weather, good visibility, and he was running south on the return leg, and he glanced at the mirror, not for any reason, not because of a sound, just the automatic mirror check that 11 years had made reflexive, and the curtain was closed. He had driven with it open. He was certain. He pulled over before the thought had finished forming. He was on the shoulder in under 4 seconds, engine running, hazards on, hands on the wheel, and he did not move for a long time. He called the OPP. He watched the curtain in the mirror while he waited. It did not move. The same constable, or a different one, he wasn't sure anymore. They blurred together, found nothing. Again. The sleeper empty, the curtain closed on its rail with no explanation that satisfied physics, or reason, or the part of Danny Kowalczuk's brain that had spent 11 years trusting what it knew about its own truck. He drives the corridor still. He checks the sleeper every time. The curtain stays open. And sometimes, on the long, straight sections north of Hearst, where the road gives back the same picture mile after mile, and the only thing that changes is the frost pattern on the asphalt, he catches himself not looking in the mirror, not because he's forgotten, because there is a version of what the mirror might show him that he has no plan for, and he'd rather not know that he's been driving toward it. The Dempster does something to a person's sense of scale that no other road in North America does, or at least that is what he had always believed, and 11 runs over 4 years had not changed his mind. It was not the longest highway he'd driven. It was not the most remote by strict geographic measure, but it had a quality that the others lacked, a quality he had never found the right word for, though he'd tried on long stretches when the radio gave out and the mind needed something to do. The closest he'd come was indifference. The land on either side of the Dempster was not hostile, it was not threatening, it simply did not register his presence at all. And there was something in that non-registration that worked on a person over hours the way cold water works on a hand. Not painful, just gradually changing the character of the thing. He left Dawson City at 10:40 p.m. Late August on the Dempster meant something specific. The sun had finally agreed to set, but only provisionally, only for a few hours, and the darkness it left behind was the thin kind, the kind that still held the memory of light at its edges. The tundra on either side of the road was that particular shade of not quite black that made distances impossible to judge. Things that were a kilometer away looked close enough to touch. Things that were close looked like they belonged to a different picture entirely. He had the load manifest on the passenger seat and a thermos of black coffee in the cup holder and the CB on channel 14, because that was the channel the Dempster regulars used, the small community of drivers who ran this road enough to have opinions about it. The channel was quiet. It was always quiet this time of night on a Tuesday in late August. The tourist season was winding down. The supply runs had mostly been done for the week, and the road was, as far as he'd been told at the depot, empty. He drove. For the first hour, he thought about nothing that mattered. The load, the fuel situation, the fact that the left wiper blade had developed a streak that he kept meaning to replace. The road surface north of Dawson was reasonable by Dempster standards, which meant it was unpaved and slightly washboarded in the sections that got heavy melt runoff, but nothing that required particular concentration. He knew where the bad corners were. He knew where the frost heaves liked to reappear every spring, regardless of how much grading had been done the previous fall. The road was familiar in the way that difficult things become familiar. Not comfortable, but known. The lights appeared at kilometer 89. He noticed them the way you notice something that your peripheral vision has already been tracking for a while before your conscious mind picks up the report. They were off to the east, maybe 200 meters from the road, moving through what he knew to be open tundra, low, rolling ground, no trees at this elevation, just dwarf willow and sedge grass and the occasional granite outcrop. Two lights, close together, white, the approximate spacing of a vehicle's headlights but lower to the ground than headlights ought to be. His first thought was, ATV. Someone running a quad on the tundra at night. Unusual but not impossible. There were hunters out here. There were people who had reasons to be in the backcountry that weren't his business. He watched them for about 30 seconds, and then the road required his attention through a curve, and he looked back to the east when he was straight again, and the lights were still there. Same distance from the road, same distance behind him, same speed. He increased his speed by 10 kilometers an hour. He watched the mirror. The lights increased by the same amount. The gap between them and his truck did not change. He sat with this information for a moment. An ATV could do the speed he was running. Some of them could do considerably more. And the tundra at this point was open enough that a good machine with a capable rider could maintain pace with a truck on a gravel road. He told himself this was the explanation, and found that he mostly believed it. He drove on. At kilometer 112, he reached the long, straight section that runs northeast before the road begins its gradual climb toward the Richardson Mountains. And here the tundra opens up wide on both sides, and visibility to the east on a clear night was significant. He could see a long way. Long enough to see that whatever was carrying those lights was moving across terrain that he now remembered clearly from daytime runs. Open ground, yes, but crossed by two drainage channels that cut across the tundra at right angles to the road in this section. Each channel was maybe 3 meters deep, steep-sided, the kind of erosion feature that would stop any wheeled vehicle cold. The lights crossed both channels without hesitation, without slowing, without any variation in their pace or their distance from his truck. What rolls across a 3-meter drainage channel at highway speed without breaking stride? He reached for the CB and keyed it. Any traffic on the Dempster tonight? Kilometer 112 northbound. Checking if anyone's got eyes on a light source moving east of the road. Static. The particular Dempster static that was different from other static. Thicker, more deliberate feeling. Though he knew that was imagination talking. He tried again. Nothing. He put the CB down and looked at the lights in his mirror, and then looked at the road, and then looked at the lights again, running this cycle for the better part of 10 minutes while the straight section unreeled in front of him, and the tundra held flat and dark on both sides. The lights had not changed their behavior in any way. They had not come closer. They had not fallen back. They had not veered north or south. They maintained their position with a precision that was, he was beginning to understand, the most unsettling thing about them. Not what they were doing, but how perfectly they were doing it. The complete absence of the small variations that real things moving across real ground produced. An ATV drifted. A snowmobile corrected. Animals moved in the arrhythmic way that living things moved. These lights moved with the regularity of something that had decided exactly what it was going to do, and was simply executing the decision without the interference of terrain or fatigue, or any of the other factors that complicated motion for things that existed in the physical world. He had been a driver for long enough to have a calibrated relationship with his own fear responses. He knew the difference between the alertness that a bad road condition produced and the deeper, older response that the body reserved for threats it couldn't categorize. The first one sharpened his attention. The second one did something different. It produced a kind of stillness, a quieting of everything except the specific faculties needed to assess what was wrong and make a decision about it. He was in the second state now. He thought about stopping. He ran this option fully, pulling to the shoulder, killing the lights, watching what the eastern lights did when he stopped. The problem with this option was what happened if the lights responded by changing course. As long as they stayed east and stayed parallel, he had a geographic relationship with them that he understood. If they turned toward the road, he would have given up the only advantage he currently possessed, which was that he was moving. He kept driving. At kilometer 134, the road begins to rise, and the terrain changes. The open tundra gives way to a landscape that is more broken, more vertical, with ridgelines starting to appear to the north and east. In daylight, this section was spectacular. At night, it meant that the lights to the east would eventually be obscured by terrain, and he found himself calculating this with an urgency that told him something about the state he was in, that he was looking forward to losing sight of the lights, the way you looked forward to losing sight of something you never wanted to have seen in the first place. The lights stayed visible longer than the terrain should have allowed. He knew these ridgelines. He'd seen them in daylight enough times to have their profiles memorized in the way that route drivers memorized everything relevant to their safety. The first ridge should have cut the sightline to the eastern flats at around kilometer 128. It hadn't. The lights had appeared to move with the terrain, staying visible above the ridgeline in a way that meant they were either on high ground, or they were. He stopped building this sentence. He called the depot on the satellite phone at kilometer 141. He got the overnight dispatcher, a woman he'd spoken to enough times to know the sound of her attention versus her half-attention, and he described what he was seeing with the deliberate flatness of a man who understood that how he said something would determine how seriously it was taken. She was quiet for a moment. "You want me to check if there are any other vehicles registered on the Dempster tonight?" He said yes. She put him on hold. He watched the lights. They were still there, visible now above a ridgeline they had no right to be above. Two white points of absolute steadiness in the thin dark of the late August Yukon night. She came back. "Nothing registered northbound or southbound tonight. Last vehicle logged out of Dawson was you. Eagle Plains had one southbound run leave at 8 p.m. He'd be back in Dawson by now." He thanked her and did not tell her to stay on the line because he understood that staying on the line would not help with any version of what was happening. He drove. The lights stayed with him through the climb into the Richardsons. They stayed with him through the section where the road cuts along a slope with a significant drop to the west, and the eastern side is a near vertical face of shale, and there is, physically, no ground to the east that anything could travel on at speed. He noted this fact. He noted it with the part of his brain that was still conducting the inventory of normal explanations and finding the shelves bare, one by one, item by item, until the inventory was complete and the result was what it was. There was nothing over there. There was nothing over there, and the lights were over there, and they had been over there for an hour and 17 minutes. He reached Eagle Plains at 2:09 a.m. The settlement was small, a hotel, a fuel station, a handful of structures, but it was lit, and it was inhabited, and when he pulled into the fuel station and got out and stood in the yellow light of the canopy, he felt the specific relief of the built world. The relief of a place that had been made deliberately by people who intended to be there. He looked east. Nothing. The darkness past the settlement's light was empty and flat and total. He fueled the truck. He went inside and got coffee he didn't need, and stood at the counter and talked to the attendant for longer than was necessary about road conditions and whether the north section had seen any frost yet, and a number of other things that were not what he was thinking about. The attendant answered everything without curiosity. People who worked overnight at Eagle Plains had seen enough long-haul drivers in altered states to have a policy of not asking. He went back to his truck. He sat for 15 minutes before starting the engine. He was working out whether to continue north or wait until there was light, until there were other vehicles on the road, until the world had enough witnesses in it to make whatever was east of the Dempster decide that pacing a lone truck in the dark was no longer worth its time. He decided to wait for light. He slept in the seat, not well, the kind of sleep that stays close to the surface, that keeps one ear in the room. Twice he woke and looked east without deciding to look east, his eyes going to the darkness past the settlement's perimeter before he was fully awake, checking. Both times there was nothing. He left Eagle Plains at 5:15 a.m., when the sky had lightened enough to show the tundra properly, to give everything back its correct distance and its correct shape. He drove the rest of the run in what passed for daylight this far north in late August, a flat, gray, generous light that put the landscape where it belonged and let him see every ridge and channel and open flat for exactly what it was. He saw nothing east of the road. He delivered the load and drove south on the return the same day. He did not stop at Eagle Plains. He ran the kilometer 134 section in the afternoon light and looked east as he passed and saw tundra and shale and the drainage channels that crossed the flat ground at right angles to the road, and he noted again, with the same quiet, careful noting he'd been doing since kilometer 89, that there was nowhere out there for a vehicle to travel at speed. There was nowhere out there for anything to maintain pace with a truck for an hour and 17 minutes without closing the distance or losing it, or being affected in any way by the ground it moved across. He filed no report. There was nothing to report. He had seen lights. The lights were gone. Every rational account of what they might have been collapsed against specific details that he was not prepared to share in a formal context, because a formal context would require him to either defend those details or abandon them, and he was not ready to do either. He still runs the Dempster. He runs it in daylight when he can arrange it. When he can't arrange it, when the load and the timing don't cooperate, and he finds himself northbound out of Dawson after dark, he watches the eastern flats from kilometer 80 onward. Most nights there is nothing. But he has learned not to let most nights make him careless about the others, because the thing about the lights that he comes back to, that he turns over in the long, straight sections when the mind does what it does on empty roads, it wasn't that they appeared. It wasn't even that they kept pace with him for over an hour across terrain that should have made that impossible. It was that they stopped when he reached Eagle Plains, not when the terrain changed, not when he slowed or accelerated, not when he turned on the high beams or keyed the CB or picked up the satellite phone. When he reached the lights of a place where other people were. Whatever was out there on the Dempster tundra knew the difference between a man alone and a man who was no longer alone. And it had been content for 1 hour and 17 minutes to simply let him know that it knew. The first thing that came back was the white line. Not the road, not the sky, not the sense of where he was or how fast he was moving. Just the white line on the right shoulder, close and steady, the way it always looked when a driver had been staring at the center line too long, and the eyes had quietly reassigned themselves to something less demanding. He watched it for what felt like several seconds before the rest of the picture assembled itself around it. The hood of the truck, the dark highway ahead, the tree line on both sides pressing close the way the Trans-Canada pressed through the shield country east of Kenora, and the clock on the dash reading 2:47 a.m. He blinked. He was driving. This was not remarkable. He had been driving since 11 p.m. out of Winnipeg, a run he'd done enough times that his body could execute it without much input from the parts of his brain responsible for conscious decision-making. The Trans-Canada between Winnipeg and Thunder Bay was that kind of road, long and direct and dark, and sufficiently familiar that experienced drivers sometimes described it as something close to muscle memory, the hands and feet maintaining their relationship with the truck, while the mind went somewhere else for a while. But something was wrong with the clock. He looked at it again. 2:47. He reached for the logic of this. He'd left Winnipeg at 11. He'd been on the road for 3 hours and 47 minutes. Which put him somewhere east of Kenora depending on his average speed, which was, and here the logic stopped finding purchase, because he could not locate the last 3 hours, not imprecisely, not in the fuzzy, compressed way that familiar drives sometimes collapsed in memory, where you arrived somewhere and thought, was that 2 hours or 3? This was different. He reached for the last 3 hours and found nothing. Not a compressed version, not a highlight reel, not even a sense of continuous passage. A gap. The kind of gap that had a shape to it, an edge on each side, and between the edges, nothing at all. He remembered the depot. He remembered the load check and signing out, and the first stretch of highway leaving the city, the orange glow of Winnipeg fading in the mirror. He remembered the fuel stop at the Husky outside of Portage La Prairie. Bad coffee, too much sugar, a conversation with the cashier about the weather system moving in from the northwest. That was 11:40 p.m. approximately, and now it was 2:47. 3 hours he could not account for. He pulled to the shoulder without deciding to pull to the shoulder. The body made the call before the mind finished processing the information. He sat with the engine running and the hazard lights going, and his hands still on the wheel, and he tried, with the methodical, almost clinical focus of a man who understood that panic was not useful, to find those 3 hours. He tried to reconstruct by feel. Was he tired in the way that 3 hours of night driving produced? He checked himself honestly. He was alert in a way that didn't match 3 hours of highway. Alert in the sharp, slightly electric way of someone who had just woken up, not the ground-down alertness of a man working through the small hours on caffeine and habit. His coffee, the bad Husky coffee in the travel mug in the cup holder, was still slightly warm. He picked it up and held it, and tried to remember drinking from it on the road and could not. He looked at the fuel gauge. He'd left Portage with 3/4 of a tank. The gauge read just under a quarter. The Trans-Canada from Portage to where he currently sat, somewhere east of Kenora by the look of the shield rock and the tree press on both sides, was approximately 530 kilometers. His truck at highway speed burned through fuel at a rate consistent with what the gauge was showing. The math worked. The truck had traveled 530 kilometers. He had no memory of 530 kilometers. What is the difference between a man who fell asleep at the wheel and a man who simply lost 3 hours? He got out. He needed to be outside the cab. He needed ground under his feet and cold air on his face and the physical reality of a specific place to anchor him, because the alternative, staying in the seat with the math and the gap and the questions, was not something he could do and remain useful to himself. The night air came in hard and cold, the shield cold that was different from prairie cold, wetter and darker, and the tree line on both sides of the road stood absolute and lightless. He walked around the front of the truck. He was checking himself, gait, balance, the quality of his physical presence in space, the way he'd been trained to check equipment, systematically, without sentiment. He felt normal. He felt, in fact, unnervingly normal. No stiffness from extended sitting, no tension in the neck and shoulders that 3+ hours of night driving always produced. His legs moved easily. His hands were steady. He walked around the passenger side. The passenger door was closed. He tried the handle and it was unlocked. He stood with his hand on the handle. He kept the passenger door locked. He'd kept it locked for 6 years of long haul, because a dispatcher he'd respected early in his career had told him to develop the habit, and he'd never dropped it. He locked the passenger door before he left every depot, every fuel stop, every roadside break. It was as automatic as checking the mirrors. It was unlocked. He opened the door, and the cab light came on, and he looked at the passenger floor mat. The mat was dark rubber, the kind that trapped dirt and showed it. He cleaned them every second week at the depot wash station, a personal habit, and they'd been clean when he'd left Winnipeg. He could see them in his memory from the pre-departure check, clean black rubber, nothing on them. There were boot prints on the passenger mat, 2 of them, clear and distinct, the tread pattern of a work boot, the kind with an aggressive lug sole, and the prints were made in something pale and dense that he looked at for a moment before identifying as clay mud. Not shield dirt, not the sandy shoulder gravel of the Trans-Canada. Clay mud, the specific gray-beige of the Red River Plain, the kind of mud that came from the fields west of Winnipeg in late autumn, after the first hard rains had got into the topsoil. Winnipeg mud. Someone had been in the passenger seat since Winnipeg. He stepped back from the door. He was standing on the shoulder of the Trans-Canada at 2:51 in the morning, in the dark of the Shield country, with 530 kilometers of road that he hadn't driven behind him, and someone's boot prints on his passenger floor, and the door that he locked every time, without exception, had been unlocked. He did not look in the sleeper. He was not ready to look in the sleeper. He called dispatch on the satellite phone. The overnight man picked up on the second ring, and he spoke to him with the careful neutrality he'd used with dispatchers his entire career, giving information, not interpretation, because interpretation was how things got complicated. He described his location by kilometer marker. He described the memory gap. He described the fuel gauge and the boot prints and the unlocked door. The dispatcher was quiet for a moment. "You need medical? Could be a neurological thing, blackouts, that kind of. I need you to tell me if anyone else was scheduled on this route tonight." "Solo run, same as always." "And my last check-in, when was it?" Another pause. He heard keyboard sounds. 11:52, outside Portage. You called in the fuel stop." "And nothing after that?" "Nothing after that." He thanked the dispatcher and said he was stopping at the next open station, and the dispatcher said he was going to flag the run for a medical review, and he said that was fine, and ended the call, and stood in the cold, and looked at the highway going east. He was thinking about the boot prints. Specifically, he was thinking about the clay content, that gray-beige Red River clay that didn't exist out here in the Shield, that existed in the fields and margins and gravel pull-offs west of Winnipeg, which meant that whoever had made those prints had been in the cab before Portage, or around Portage, before or during the fuel stop, which meant, and this was the part that the mind kept delivering to him, and that he kept receiving with the same terrible clarity, that someone had potentially been in the passenger seat when he was at the fuel stop, when he'd gone inside for the bad coffee, when he'd talked to the cashier about the weather for 3 or 4 minutes with the truck sitting outside the glass doors and the yellow canopy light, passenger door locked. He'd been certain. He was always certain about this one thing. But the prints were dry. He went back to the door and looked at them again. The mud had dried to a pale crust. For mud from a clay soil to dry completely in an enclosed cab with the heater running, he estimated, without confidence, several hours. He forced himself to look in the sleeper. He pulled the curtain. The mattress was undisturbed. The storage at the foot was closed and latched. His duffel was where he'd put it. There was nothing there. He checked the external compartments, the storage lockers on both sides, the space behind the cab. He used his flashlight, and he was thorough, and he found nothing. Whoever had been in the passenger seat was not in the truck now. He drove to Dryden. The next open fuel station was a 24-hour place just off the highway, and he pulled in and sat under the canopy lights for a long moment before going inside. The woman behind the counter was in her 50s and had the specific solidity of someone who had worked overnight shifts long enough to have shed any capacity for being surprised by the things that came through her door at 3 a.m. He bought water and a chocolate bar he didn't want and stood at the counter. "You all right?" she said. Not with particular concern, just the practiced read of someone who knew what a person in a specific kind of distress looked like. He said he thought so. "You look like you lost something." He said he supposed he had. He sat in the parking lot for an hour. He was doing the thing that he did when a mechanical problem on the truck was beyond his ability to diagnose roadside, running the system from the beginning, testing each component in sequence, trying to find where the normal ended and the wrong began. He'd left Winnipeg. He'd stopped at Portage. He had a memory of the cashier, the too sweet coffee, the weather comment. He'd gotten back in the truck. After that, the white line. 2:47. 530 kilometers later. He'd been driving. The truck had gone where he'd pointed it. He had not crashed, had not left the road, had not stopped. The fuel gauge confirmed continuous travel at highway speed. His body showed no evidence of 3 hours in a seat. The boot prints were dry. He could construct a version of this that involved a medical event, a seizure variant, a dissociative episode, something neurological that had allowed the body to continue performing a deeply habituated task while the conscious mind was entirely absent. He'd read about this. It happened. Experienced drivers on familiar routes, extreme fatigue, the autopilot function of a well-trained body. This version did not include the boot prints, and it did not include the unlocked door. He drove the rest of the run to Thunder Bay in a state that he would later describe to the company doctor, who he saw 2 days later, who found nothing wrong, who used the word dissociation several times in a way that meant he was offering it as a container for something he also couldn't fully explain, as simply very awake. Not frightened exactly, though fear was present. More than fear, a kind of attention so complete that it excluded everything that wasn't the road and the mirrors and the passenger seat, which he checked every 4 minutes for the rest of the drive. and which was empty every time he checked it. He delivered the load at 5:40 a.m. He had the passenger floor mat replaced at the Thunder Bay depot before he drove back. He told the maintenance man he'd spilled something. The man pulled the old mat and dropped it in the waste bin and fitted the new one, and that was the end of the physical evidence. He watched the old mat go into the bin and felt something he couldn't name. Not relief, not the opposite of relief. Something more like the feeling of a door closing on a question that would never get an answer. The company doctor cleared him for driving. The medical review found nothing. His logbook showed the gap as a continuous driving period because that was what had happened. The truck had traveled, the log had recorded the travel, and the fact that he had no memory of it was a medical matter and not a logbook matter. He kept the route. He kept it for the same reason he'd always kept difficult things, because stopping felt like a different kind of loss, and because the alternative was to sit somewhere and think about it, which was worse. He locks the passenger door now with a physical check that goes beyond habit. He grips the handle from outside and pulls twice, hard, before every departure. He does it at fuel stops. He does it at every break. He does this even though he understands, and has understood since he stood on that Shield Country shoulder at 2:51 in the morning doing the math on his own fuel gauge, that a locked door had not been enough before. He doesn't know what would have been enough. He doesn't know what was in the passenger seat for those 3 hours, or whether whatever it was had been there since Winnipeg, or had joined him somewhere in those 530 kilometers he can't account for. He doesn't know if it was the presence that caused the gap, or if the gap existed first, and the presence found it. What he knows is this: the road between Winnipeg and Thunder Bay is 702 kilometers. He has driven it more times than he can count. He knows every curve, every frost heave, every section where the shield rock comes close to the road, and the tree line opens suddenly into a long view north. He does not know what it looks like between kilometer 190 and kilometer 720. He has never been able to remember. The static crackled like something alive. 11 hours behind the wheel, and the stretch of Route 389 cutting through northern Quebec had turned the world into a tunnel. 2 pale cones of headlight, and nothing else. No towns, no overpasses, no southbound rigs, just black spruce pressing close on either side of the road, and the occasional reflector post catching my beams like a deer eye in the dark. I had a load of copper pipe heading to Vermont, and I was making good time until the radio died somewhere past Barriere Lake, and left me alone with the engine noise and my own breathing. I found Channel 19 out of habit more than hope. Truckers didn't run this corridor much after September. Too much weather, too little traffic, too far between anything that could help you if something went sideways. I had done the run 4 times before, and never once raised another driver on the CB north of La Belle-sur-Quévillon. But my thumb went to the scan button anyway, the way your tongue finds a loose tooth, and when I landed on 19 and heard a voice, I nearly ran off the shoulder. "Anybody copy? Any southbound on 389? I need a copy right now, please. Somebody copy." The voice was young, or it sounded young, compressed and frantic and threaded through with something that made my chest go tight before my brain even processed why. I reached for the handset. "Copy that, unknown. Northbound 389 out of Gagnon. What's your 20, over?" Silence. Then static that seemed to breathe. "Oh, thank God." The voice broke on the last word. "Thank God, okay. I'm in the ditch about 40 kilometers south of kilometer marker 445. I came around a curve and there was, I don't know what it was, something on the road, and I swerved and the rig went over. I'm hurt. I think my leg is bad. I can't get out. Please, you have to. I can't feel my feet right." I was already checking my mirrors out of pure muscle memory, already doing the math. I had passed marker 420 maybe 20 minutes ago, so this driver was ahead of me, not behind. I hadn't come up on any accident. "I'm northbound of your position," I said. "You still with me? What are you hauling?" "Running empty, heading back to Septile. Please, it's cold." The cab tilted and the door is against the ground and I can't get the passenger side open. It's cold out and I'm bleeding. "Okay, stay with me. I'm turning around right now." I pulled the rig over at a widening where the gravel shoulder flared out, did a careful 3-point turn, and got myself pointed south. The heater was running full blast, but my hands felt cold on the wheel. I picked up the handset. "I'm southbound now. You still with me? Over." Yes, I'm here. Please hurry." "How long have you been in the ditch?" "I don't, maybe 2 hours. My phone has no signal." I tried the CB right away, but nobody answered, and I thought nobody was coming. 2 hours alone in a flipped cab in October in northern Quebec. I pushed the truck up to the fastest speed I was comfortable holding on this road and watched the kilometer markers. 432, 430. I kept him talking because that was what you did. You kept them talking. You got family waiting on you? Yeah, my wife. We have a daughter, she just turned 3. A pause, and through the static I could hear something shift in his voice. Something softer underneath the fear, like a pocket of warm air inside a cold house. She loves horses. Can't even say the word right yet. Calls them horses. Don't you dare correct her, I said. My granddaughter calls spaghetti spaghetti. I'm taking that word to my grave. He laughed. It was a short, fractured sound, but it was real, and it did something good to the tension sitting behind my sternum. Marker 438. I scanned both shoulders, both ditches. Nothing. Trees and dark and the occasional glitter of frost on the road surface. Talk to me. You still awake? I'm here. It hurts. I know. You're doing good. I'm at 438 right now. I'm coming. Okay, I can almost see a light, I think. Are your lights on? High beams, full rack. I think I can see you. Something loosened in my chest. Good. Keep talking to me. I passed 440, then 442, then 444, then 445, and I slowed to a crawl, leaning forward over the wheel, putting my face close to the glass like proximity to the windshield could make me see better. Both sides of the road, both ditches, the spruce trees stood in rigid ranks, and the road curved ahead, and I could see the reflectors on the guardrail sections, and nothing else. No truck, no cab overlying on its side, no tire marks cutting through the gravel and over the edge. Nothing. I stopped in the middle of the road. There was no other traffic to worry about. I sat there with the engine idling and looked at a stretch of Route 389 that contained exactly no evidence of any accident, any vehicle, any person. I picked up the handset. Come back. I'm at marker 445. I don't see you. Over. Static. I'm right here. Where are you? Over. More static. The kind that seems like it has texture, like it's made of something other than electrical interference. Have you ever heard a sound and understood in your body, before your mind caught up, that it was wrong? That whatever was producing it was not what it claimed to be? Then, keep going south. I'm past 445. I think I miscounted the markers. Keep going. I let out a breath. Miscounted markers. That happened, especially in distress, especially in the dark. I put the truck in gear and continued south. 446. 447. I was going slow enough now that I could see every foot of both shoulders, every dip where a vehicle could have gone over. I'm at 447, still nothing. You sure about your position? I'm sure. I can see your lights. They're so bright. Keep coming. I'm coming. At 452, I stopped again. I had now driven 14 kilometers past where he said he was. I had seen nothing. No skid marks, no debris, no broken guardrail, no tire tracks pressed into the gravel. The ditches on this stretch were shallow and clear and completely, perfectly empty. I sat with the engine running and looked at my own hands on the wheel, and understood, somewhere in the part of my brain that lives below language, that something was wrong in a way that had no practical explanation. The kind of wrong that doesn't announce itself loudly, the kind that settles into you quietly, like cold water rising around your ankles before you even realize you're standing in it. I picked up the handset. I've gone past 452. I don't see anything. There's nothing here. Over. The static held for so long that I had almost decided to just drive, south, fast, all the way to the next town, all the way to people and light and cell signal, when the voice came back. It sounded different now, not frightened, patient. I know, it said. I can see your lights. I looked in my mirrors. The road behind me was empty and dark. I looked in my side view mirrors and saw the reflectors on my own trailer glowing red in my brake lights. I looked at the road ahead and saw nothing but my headlights reaching into the black, pointing south, pointing away from wherever that voice was supposed to be coming from. And that was the thing that found me, sitting in that idling cab at kilometer 452 at 2 in the morning. If I was pointing south, and my lights were pointing south, then the only way to see my lights, to actually see them head-on, blazing and bright the way you described them, was to be standing behind my truck. Not in the ditch, Not 40 kilometers back. Right there. Maybe 8 feet off my rear bumper. Close enough to touch the trailer doors. Close enough to be visible in my mirror if I chose to look. I did not look. I put the truck in gear and I drove. I drove south, and I did not touch the CB, and I did not slow down, and I kept my eyes on the road ahead because I had made a decision somewhere between the thought and the fear that I was not going to look in those mirrors. That whatever was in them, or not in them, I was not going to give it the satisfaction of being seen, and I was not going to give myself the memory of seeing it. I told myself later that it was a prank. 2 guys with a radio, parked on a side road somewhere, running the bit on lone truckers for entertainment. I told myself this with some conviction for about 3 days. I told my wife it was just a long haul, that I was tired, that the road played tricks on you up there in the dark. I did not tell her about the voice or the markers, or the way the static had seemed to breathe between transmissions. I did not tell her that I had driven 60 kilometers with every light in that cab blazing, both exterior mirrors folded in so I could not see them, hands locked at 10 and 2, jaw set hard enough to ache, because some part of me, the part that was not interested in logic, the part that had kept our species alive in dark forests for 100,000 years, that part had decided that whatever was back there could not be engaged with, could not be reasoned with, could not be acknowledged in any way that might constitute a response. Because here is what I keep coming back to, sitting in my own driveway in the daylight, drinking coffee that has gone cold while I stare at nothing. It said, I can see your lights, not I can hear your engine, not I can see your taillights, not the red glow of your brakes or the amber of your running lights, or anything you would describe if you were looking at a truck from behind. It said, I can see your lights. The way you would say it if you were looking at the front of the truck. If the headlights were pointing at you. If you were standing in the road somewhere ahead of where I was driving, waiting, watching 2 high beams come toward you through the dark. But I was pointing south. There was nothing ahead of me, which means whatever could see my lights the way you see headlights, face on, blazing, coming straight at you, was not ahead of me, and was not behind me, and was not in any location that made sense for a thing that existed in the same physical world I was driving through. I don't run 389 at night anymore. People ask me why, and I tell them the road isn't worth it after dark, which is true in ways I don't elaborate on. I still drive. I still find Channel 19 out of habit when I'm running a lonely stretch and the radio's gone quiet. I still hear the static between stations, that particular texture of silence that isn't quite silence. But I never answer anymore, because somewhere out there between the markers, something learned the shape of my lights, and I have a feeling that if it ever sees them again, it will know exactly who to call. The coffee at that truck stop had been burning on the burner since sometime before midnight, and it tasted like it knew that about itself. I wrapped both hands around the mug anyway because it was something to hold on to, and because the old man sitting across from me had just gone quiet in a way that felt like a door closing, and I didn't want to be the one who opened my mouth and broke whatever was happening in the air between us. He was maybe 68, 69, the kind of face that had been outside in all weather for 40 years, and had stopped apologizing for it. Deep-set eyes the color of creek water in November. Hands so worked over they looked like they belonged to a larger species. He had flagged me down when I came in from the lot, which surprised me because I had never seen him before in my life. Just raised 2 fingers from his booth like he was hailing a cab, and something about the gesture made me walk over without thinking about it, the way you respond to a certain tone of voice before you've parsed the actual words. You running north tomorrow? He asked, before I even sat down. Trans-Labrador, yeah. He nodded like I'd confirmed something he already knew. He looked down at his coffee. He didn't say anything for long enough that I started wondering if I'd misread the situation entirely. If he was just a lonely old man who wanted company, and had run out of things to say before I arrived. Then he said, I did that run for 31 years. Long time, I said. It is. He turned the mug in a slow circle on the table. I'm done now. Last run was August. Handed in my medical card, signed the paperwork, the whole thing. He said it without any particular emotion, the way you'd describe returning a library book. My wife says I should feel relieved. Don't you? He looked at me then for just a moment, and something moved behind his eyes that I couldn't name. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like the expression you'd wear if someone asked you whether you felt relieved that a very large animal had stopped standing outside your window. Technically, yes, but relief wasn't really the right word for what you felt. "Sure," he said. He went back to looking at his coffee. "Now here's what I want you to understand about what happened next, because I've thought about it many times since that night, and I still don't have a clean way to explain it. The man didn't perform anything. He didn't lean forward or lower his voice or set the scene. He didn't say what I'm about to tell you is going to disturb you, or brace yourself, or any of the things people say when they want you to know that something important is coming. He just started talking, in the same flat, almost bored tone he'd used to tell me about his wife and his retirement paperwork, and the story came out of him like water out of a pipe that had been waiting for someone to open the tap. He told me it happened on his 22nd year. Late November, Trans-Labrador, eastbound out of Labrador City at around 2 in the morning. He knew that road the way some men know a woman they've been married to for decades, every mood, every tendency, every place where it got dangerous when it had been drinking. He had driven it in whiteouts bad enough that visibility dropped to the length of his hood. He had driven it with a fever of 102 because the load couldn't wait and the relief driver hadn't shown. He had driven it in the specific miserable combination of freezing rain and black ice that transformed that highway into something that wanted to kill you. And he had never, his word, never, felt anything on that road that he could not account for. He stopped, drank some coffee. Do you know the feeling of reading a book and coming to a page that's been torn out? That specific frustration of the narrative interrupted, the shape of the missing thing somehow worse than if the story had never started. "What happened?" I asked. He set the mug down. He looked at the window beside us, which showed nothing but the parking lot and the dark beyond it, and our own reflections in the glass. Faint and slightly wrong, the way reflections in dark windows always are. "There was a rest stop," he said. "Small one. Just a pull-off with a pit toilet and a picnic table that nobody had used since probably 1987. I had been stopping there for 22 years. Same spot every run, give or take. You get superstitious about things like that after a while. Same coffee mug, same route, same rest stop. It's not logic. It's just the way the miles make you." I nodded. I pulled in and shut the engine down. He paused. "That's when I noticed the other truck." He described it the way you'd describe furniture in a room, matter-of-factly, no inflection. It was parked at the far end of the pull-off, lights off, engine off, just sitting there in the dark. An older rig, he said. He couldn't make out the markings in the dark, and he wasn't particularly close to it. He didn't think much of it. Drivers slept in their cabs all the time, especially on long corridors like the Trans-Labrador, where the distances between anything resembling civilization could stretch your legal hours paper-thin. He got out, used the pit toilet, stood in the cold for a few minutes because he always did, because the cold woke him up better than the coffee, and he still had 4 hours to Goose Bay. The sky was clear, and there were more stars than sky, the way it gets up there when you're far enough from any light source that the darkness becomes structural, something you could lean against. He was about to get back in his cab when he noticed that the other truck didn't have any condensation on the windshield. "It was maybe -18, he said. I had been parked for 10 minutes and my windshield already had a skim of frost on the inside of the glass where my breath had been. That's just what happens. The cab cools that fast when the engine's off." He looked at the table. That truck had been sitting there with its engine off, in -18, and there was nothing on the windshield. No frost. No condensation, nothing. Meaning no breath had fogged the glass from inside. Meaning if there was a driver in that cab, he wasn't breathing. "I thought maybe it had been there a long time," he said, "long enough to fully equalize to the outside temperature, so there was no differential to cause condensation. That's possible. That's a reasonable explanation." He said it like he was reading from a list of reasonable explanations he had compiled over a long period of time and was still not convinced by. But a cab that cold, a person can't survive that. And if nobody was in it, why was it there? The Trans-Labrador isn't a road you park on and walk away from. There's nowhere to walk to. He went to the other truck. He said this simply, and I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach in a way I was not prepared for, because the whole time he'd been talking, I had been half convinced that the payoff was going to be something with a rational explanation, a lost driver, a medical episode, something terrible but terrestrial, And now here he was telling me he had walked across a gravel pull-off in the middle of the night on the Trans-Labrador toward a truck that might have contained a dead man, and he said it the way you'd say I walked to the mailbox. Why? I asked. He looked at me like the question confused him slightly. Because if there was someone in there who needed help, I was the only person for 100 kilometers who could give it. He knocked on the driver's door. Nothing. He tried the handle. Unlocked. He opened it. Here is where the story changed shape, not because of what he found. He paused for long enough that I thought I understood what that pause meant, and I was already building the image in my head, the slumped figure, the cold, the blue, but because of what he said next, which was nothing. He sat across from me at that sticky table under those flat fluorescent lights, and he did not tell me what was in the cab. He picked up his coffee. He drank some. He set it down. I got back in my truck, he said. I finished my run. I filed a report when I reached Goose Bay, and some people went out there and... He stopped. They handled it. What did they find? I asked. In your report, what did you say you saw? He looked at me with those November Creek eyes, and something in them was very tired and very far away. And also, underneath all of that, something that I can only describe as careful. The way a man looks when he has spent a very long time deciding how much to tell, and has landed on an amount that he's prepared to live with. I said I found an abandoned vehicle, he said, which was accurate. But, which was accurate, he said again, and his voice didn't change at all, didn't harden or warn or perform anything. And that was worse than if he had told me to drop it. It was the voice of a man who had made peace with a boundary and was simply standing at it, not aggressively, just permanently. We sat there for a while. The cook dropped something in the kitchen, and the sound cracked through the diner like a starter pistol, and we both didn't flinch, which told me we were both sitting in our own heads and trying to look like we weren't. 31 years, I finally said. And that was the only time? That was the only time, he said. And you kept running the route. I kept running the route. Why? He thought about that. He actually seemed to think about it, turning the question over the way he'd been turning that mug, looking at it from different angles. Outside, a rig pulled into the lot and the headlights swept across the window, and for a second our reflections disappeared and then reappeared, and I noticed that in the brief moment they were gone, I had held my breath. You ever have a dog that was afraid of something? He said. Not a specific thing, not thunderstorms or the vacuum cleaner, just sometimes, for no reason you could identify, the dog would stop walking and look at a particular spot, a corner, a patch of wall, nothing there, but the dog knew something. Sure, I said. You don't stop trusting the dog, he said. But you also don't stop walking. You just walk a little differently through that part of the house. You know it's there. It knows you know. And you've got an agreement, I suppose, even if nobody signed anything. He put some bills on the table without counting them and slid out of the booth. He was taller than I expected, the kind of tall that gets hidden when you're sitting down. He picked up his jacket from the seat beside him and put it on with the careful movements of someone whose shoulders had opinions about the weather. Get some sleep before you go out, he said. The first 100 kilometers out of Labrador City are fine. It's after that where the road starts thinking. He walked to the door. He didn't look back. I sat there for a long time after he left. The cook refilled my coffee without being asked, and I wrapped my hands around the new mug and stared at the window and the dark parking lot beyond it. And after a while, I realized I was looking for his truck, trying to figure out which rig was his, wanting to see it pull out onto the highway and take its taillights with it and leave the lot ordinary. But I couldn't find it. I watched for a while longer and I kept not finding it. And at some point I became aware that I was doing the math in a way that didn't add up cleanly. He had been sitting in that booth when I arrived, before I'd pulled my rig in, which meant he'd been there a while, which meant his truck should have been in the lot already, cold soaked in the November air, the windshield doing what windshields do in minus temperatures. I did not go out to look. I told myself it was because I was tired, because I had a long run in the morning and I needed to sleep, and I was not going to spend the night checking truck windshields in a parking lot in Baie-Comeau over a story told by a stranger over bad coffee. I told myself that. I went to my cab and I locked the door, and I lay down in my bunk, and I stared at the ceiling for 4 hours, And at no point during those 4 hours did I believe that the reason I hadn't gone to check the trucks was because I was tired. The real reason was simpler. The real reason was that somewhere between him describing the frost that wasn't there and the cab door swinging open on a cold November night on the Trans-Labrador, I had understood that there were things on that highway that had made an agreement with him, that had let him finish his 31 years and hand in his medical card and come sit in a diner in Baie-Comeau and almost tell a story to a stranger who was heading north in the morning. And I had understood something else too, something he hadn't said directly but that sat underneath everything he had said, the way cold water sits underneath thin ice. The agreement wasn't his to give away. It didn't transfer. I drove north in the morning because the load couldn't wait, and because not driving north would have meant knowing that I was afraid. And there are things a person can live with, and things they cannot. And knowing you were afraid of a road was one of the things on the wrong side of that line. I stopped at that rest stop. I didn't mean to. It was just there. The same gravel pull-off and the same pit toilet and the same picnic table that hadn't been used since probably 1987. And my hands moved the truck onto the gravel before my brain put forward any objection. I sat with the engine running. I looked at the empty lot. I did not shut the engine off. I pulled back onto the highway after a minute, or maybe it was longer than a minute, and I drove east, and I didn't look in my mirrors, and the road was exactly what it always was, cold and long and indifferent, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. That's the thing I keep telling myself, on the nights when I'm in a bunk somewhere, and the dark outside is the specific quality of dark that exists only at distance from everything. And I hear the engine cooling, and the wind on the aluminum skin of the trailer, and my own breathing in the small enclosed space. Nothing happened. I just wish I knew what he saw in that cab, because whatever it was, he drove 22 more years with it living in him, quiet and settled, like something that had found a room it liked and decided to stay. And now he's retired, and I'm still running north. The darkness never really ends. It just waits for the next story. If these roads, these voices, these silences got under your skin the way they got under mine, you already know where you belong. Subscribe to Mr. Darkveil, hit the bell, and stay close. The next story is already out there somewhere, driving toward your lights.